Welcome, my friend. If you're looking for a quiet space to let your mind rest and your body relax, you've come to the right place. Tonight, let me take you to a place far away, a place forgotten by time, a place where the earth seems to whisper its secrets into the wind, a place so harsh, so unforgiving, yet so mesmerizing we cannot look away. Tonight, we journey into Death Valley, a name that sounds foreboding, almost threatening. But behind that name lies a strange world of extremes, of surreal landscapes, lost stories, and mysteries that still linger in the silence of the desert. Chapter 1. Where Earth Pushes Itself to the Limit. Imagine a place so hot the ground could cook your skin. In 1913 at Furnace Creek, the temperature hit 56.7 degrees Celsius, or 134 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest temperature ever reliably recorded on Earth. That record still stands. But Death Valley isn't just the hottest. It's also the lowest place in North America. The Badwater Basin sinks 86 meters below sea level, just 130 kilometers from Mount Whitney, the highest point in the contiguous United States. Two extremes side by side, as if nature wanted to test its own limits. Rain rarely falls here, less than 5 centimeters, about 2 inches a year. This is one of the driest places on the planet, a place where water barely touches the earth. The land is cracked and split. Salt flats glisten under the sun. Volcanic rock formations rise like frozen waves. There are rainbow-colored hills, sculpted by layers of iron and manganese over millions of years. It's a place where the earth wears its scars openly, and each scar tells a story. Chapter 2. Dreams in the Dust. Let's drift back in time, to the late 1800s. Prospectors poured into the valley chasing dreams of gold and silver, but they also found something else: borax, a white mineral once used to make soap and glass. They dug, they built, and then they left. Now, the towns they once called home sit empty, ghost towns abandoned to the winds and sand. But Death Valley wasn't just a land of failed dreams. It was a place of strange experiments, too. In the 1850s, the U.S. military imported camels from the Middle East, hoping to test them as desert transport. The camels did well. The humans, not so much. Many settlers heading westward across the Mojave Desert never made it out. It was they who gave this place its name, Death Valley, a name born of desperation. Chapter 3. Strange Phenomena and Forgotten Places. Now, let me tell you about something truly strange. There's a dry lake bed called Racetrack Playa, where giant rocks, some weighing dozens of pounds, move on their own. No one's ever seen them move, but long, curved trails stretch behind them across the cracked surface. The current theory? A rare combination of thin ice sheets and strong winds. But many still wonder, what else might be moving out there in the dark? And when night falls, Death Valley transforms. It becomes one of the best places in America to see the stars. Recognized as a dark sky park, there's almost no light pollution here. You can see the Milky Way, not as a concept or photograph, but with your own eyes, stretching across the heavens like an ancient river of light. And then there are the ghost towns. Like Rhyolite, once a booming gold rush city, now nothing more than ruins and shadows. Walls crumble,
Windows gape open, and among the scattered buildings, statues made of pale stone stand like silent souls, waiting for something or someone. Death Valley is not a place made for people, but perhaps that's why it calls to us, because in its silence, in its heat and emptiness, we find something pure, something ancient, something that reminds us how small we are and how powerful the earth can be. Close your eyes. Feel the imaginary sun warming your face, the wind pushing across your skin, the whisper of sand at your feet. And then, as if from beneath the salt and stone, a voice echoes in the stillness. You have arrived. Now listen to the story I've been waiting to tell. Chapter 2. Where the Earth Burns Slowly. Part 1. Introducing the landscape and extreme temperatures. The desert doesn't scream. It doesn't roar. It whispers. And in Death Valley, its whispers come in waves of heat that shimmer across the horizon, in silent dooms that shift ever so slowly, and in cracked earth that seems to sigh under the weight of time. This is not just the hottest place in North America. It is one of the most extreme environments on Earth, a place where the sun reigns without apology, where shade is a rare treasure, and where summer is not just a season, it's a test of survival. But here, in this valley of silence, nature tells a different kind of story. Look out across the landscape. Rolling salt flats stretch like sheets of white glass. Distant mountains shimmer like mirages. Canyons, deep and shadowed, cut into the earth like ancient scars. The name Death Valley may sound dramatic, but it is no exaggeration. In July of 1913, a temperature of 134 degrees Fahrenheit, 56.7 degrees Celsius, was recorded at Furnace Creek, still considered by many as the hottest temperature ever reliably measured on Earth. But the valley doesn't just burn during the day. Even at night, the warmth lingers. It clings to the rocks, radiates from the sand, and wraps itself around anything brave enough to remain. And yet, it's quiet here, peaceful, almost dreamlike. In the stillness of dusk, when the winds pause and the sky turns gold, Death Valley becomes something else entirely. A place that feels forgotten by time. A land where the earth breathes slowly, where heat moves like memory, and where those who listen closely might hear stories carried by the dust. Welcome to the beginning of our journey. Part 2. Strange Geographic Points. Badwater Basin, Furnace Creek, Zabriskie Point. As we drift deeper into the heart of Death Valley, the landscape begins to change, not with movement, but with meaning. Each location here carries a story carved into stone, sun, and silence. Let's begin with Badwater Basin. Lying 282 feet below sea level, it is the lowest point in North America. But it's not a basin in the traditional sense. Instead, it's a salt flat, an endless stretch of white glittering crust cracked like ancient porcelain. Long ago, this place was covered by a prehistoric lake known as Lake Manly. Over time, it evaporated, leaving behind a salty graveyard. When the rare rain does fall, the water collects in shallow pools, only to vanish again, leaving intricate crystal formations behind. Its name, Badwater, came from a frustrated traveler whose mule refused to drink from the salty puddles. The irony? That undrinkable water is the very essence of life here, shaping the land in its absence. A little north, we arrive at Furnace Creek. Don't let the quaint name fool you. This place holds the infamous record for the highest air temperature ever recorded. But Furnace Creek is more than just a hot spot. It was once home to the Timbisha Shoshone, a Native American people who lived here long before weather stations and tourists arrived. They understood the rhythms of this land, crafting homes from mesquite and earth, and walking barefoot across what we now call inhospitable terrain. Today, Furnace Creek hosts a visitor center, a few shaded oases, and a surprising patch of green, thanks to irrigation. But beyond the man-made comforts, the spirit of heat remains. It's a place where the sun seems closer, where even the shadows feel warm. And then, rising in soft waves like frozen liquid, we find Zabriskie Point. This surreal landscape is not a mirage, it's geology on display. The folds and ridges were shaped by ancient floods, ash deposits, and the relentless sculpting of wind. Stand atop the viewpoint at sunrise, and the hills begin to glow in gold, amber, and rose, colors you wouldn't expect from a desert. Zabriskie Point was once the site of borax mining operations in the late 1800s. Men and mules worked under cruel sun, hauling pale minerals across unforgiving trails. Today, only the earth remembers. It holds those scars in it. Part 3. Geology beneath the silence. To understand why Death Valley looks and feels the way it does, we must go deeper into the bones of the earth itself. The story of this land is not just one of weather and time, but of ancient collisions, ruptures, and transformations hidden beneath the silence. Death Valley lies within the Basin and Range Province, a vast region of the western United States, where the Earth's crust has been stretched and thinned over millions of years. This stretching caused massive blocks of the crust to break and tilt, forming alternating mountain ranges and valleys. Around 30 million years ago, powerful geologic forces began pulling the region apart. As tension built in the crust, large blocks of land sank downward, while others were thrust upward. Death Valley is one of these sunken blocks, known as a graben, flanked by the towering Panamint Range to the west and the Black Mountains to the east. The valley continues to drop even today. Fault lines like the Death Valley Fault Zone are still active, shifting ever so slightly each year. These slow but steady movements cause earthquakes, reshape the land, and ensure that the valley keeps sinking while the mountains grow higher. The geology here is exposed like a book without a cover. In the canyon walls and eroded hillsides, we can see layers upon layers of ancient rock, some more than 1.7 billion years old. These rocks tell of long-lost oceans, volcanic eruptions, and even glacial activity from ages past. Some rocks sparkle with salt and gypsum, remnants of ancient lake beds. Others are rich with ash and basalt, signs of fire and lava, and still others are smooth and dark, shaped by water that has long since vanished. The shifting of tectonic plates didn't just shape the land, it shaped life. As the valley dropped and the climate dried, ecosystems changed. Ancient lakes disappeared, new habitats formed, and everything, plants, animals, and people, had to adapt or vanish. In a strange way, the violence beneath Death Valley gave birth to its serenity. The heat, the salt, the silence, they are all results of a restless earth finally at rest. For now. So when you walk through this landscape, you're not just stepping on sand, you're walking across a timeline of Earth's memory, a place where stone remembers fire, where the ground whispers stories older than language, and where, beneath the silence, the earth still stirs.
Part 4. Summer. When sand can cook eggs.
By the time summer arrives in Death Valley, the desert has already been whispering for months. But now it begins to shout, not in sound, but in sensation. The heat here is not merely hot. It is aggressive, assertive, absolute. Air shimmers above the ground. Thermometers struggle to keep up. On some days, it feels like even the shadows have given up. Furnace Creek, the symbolic heart of the valley, routinely reaches over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius. On certain afternoons, you could crack an egg on the pavement and watch it slowly cook, not with flames, but with patience. It's become a kind of mythic challenge among visitors. The reality? Most eggs never quite sizzle unless you use a pan. But that doesn't stop people from trying. Cars are left running with air conditioners blasting. Steering wheels are wrapped in towels to avoid burns. Locals and rangers know better than to travel after mid-morning. Even seasoned hikers venture out only at dawn or dusk, if at all. Animals too adapt. Kangaroo rats stay underground through the day, emerging at night to forage in the cooler dark. Lizards dart from rock to rock, never lingering. Ravens fly high where the air is thinner, and bighorn sheep climb the ridges to catch passing breezes. Everything here has learned the language of heat, and those who haven't rarely last long. Yet there's beauty in the brutality. Sunsets blaze across the sky in shades of fire and blood. Nightfall brings silence so complete it feels sacred. And in those twilight hours, when the sand still radiates the memory of daylight, you might lie back and feel the earth hum beneath you, a furnace with a pulse. Summer in Death Valley is not for the faint-hearted, but for those who endure it. It offers a glimpse into the raw, unfiltered power of our planet, a reminder that the earth, in all its fury and fire, still breathes, and sometimes it cooks.
Part 5. When the desert turns strange. Floods, snow, and alien storms. It might sound impossible, even laughable, to say that Death Valley, the driest place in North America, can flood. Or that snow can dust its peaks. Or that windstorms can sweep across the land like ghosts. But out here, in the extremes, the rules bend. Every few years, the skies open up. Rain falls not as a gentle whisper, but as a sudden assault. The ground, hardened and cracked, cannot absorb it fast enough. Water races down dry washes, carving paths through the sand. Roads vanish, trails become rivers, and sometimes whole canyons echo with the roar of flash floods. These moments are rare, but when they arrive, they remind everyone that even a desert can surprise you. In 2004, and again in 2015, massive rain events turned the salt flats into shallow lakes, reflecting mountains like mirrors. Tourists waded ankle-deep in places that were bone dry just days before. Then comes winter. Not always, not predictably, but sometimes.
The surrounding mountains, like the Panamints and the Funeral Range, catch moisture and cold. Snow falls high above, dusting the ridges in white. On clear mornings, the sight is breathtaking. Blinding salt below, snow-capped peaks above. And then there are the storms. Not the kind with thunder and lightning, but with wind. Fierce, howling gusts that scream across the valley floor. They lift sand into the air, blotting out the sun. Visibility drops to nothing. In the chaos, dunes shift. Paths are lost. The air becomes a sea of dust and grit. These winds, called dust devils when small and haboobs when vast, shape more than just sand. They sculpt the experience of the place. They remind you that silence is not always peaceful, and stillness can vanish in an instant. So while Death Valley is known for heat, it is also a land of contrast, of extremes, of sudden change. One day, blazing sun. The next, a flood. One morning, clear skies. That night, a storm that erases the stars. In this desert, nothing is guaranteed, except that nature always has the final word.
Part 6. Life in the Valley. Those who stayed behind. Most pass through Death Valley. Few stay, but some always have. Long before maps marked this place as a blank or labeled it as death, the Timbisha Shoshone called it home. They knew its rhythms. They didn't conquer it, they lived with it. Their homes were made of brush and earth, angled to catch the slightest breeze. Their paths wound through canyons, guided by memory and the stars. They gathered mesquite pods, hunted desert bighorn, and drew water from seeps others never noticed. In a land where survival seems a miracle, they lived generation after generation. Then came others, miners drawn by dreams of borax and gold, ranchers hoping to carve pasture from sand, park rangers, scientists, wanderers, and hermits, each drawn by the silence or the strangeness or the beauty. Some stayed only until the heat became too much. Others never left. You'll find them in the stories of tiny outposts like Scotty's Castle, a Spanish-style villa built not by a wealthy tycoon, but by the strange friendship between a con man and a millionaire. Or in Stovepipe Wells, where travelers once traded stories under lantern light, hoping the next well wouldn't be dry. Even today, a small number call the valley home. Caretakers, historians, desert souls. They wake to silence. They live with the sun. They learn when to hide from the wind and when to welcome the stillness. And then there are the visitors. They come by the thousands, seeking something they can't quite name. A challenge, a quiet, a photograph, a story. Some leave with sunburns, others leave changed. Because Death Valley isn't just a place, it's a mirror. What you bring into it, your fears, your awe, your silence, echoes back at you. And those who stay, even for a while, often find themselves listening to something deeper. A whisper in the rocks, a memory in the wind, a sense that time here doesn't move, it lingers. This is where the earth burns, slowly, but it lives. And so do the people who dare to walk its edge.
Chapter 3. Echoes of Time. Gold, Ghosts, and the Human Trace. Part 1. First Footprints. Native Life and Prehistoric Survival. Long before prospectors, tourists, and park rangers ever set eyes on Death Valley, this seemingly uninhabitable land was home to people who knew its secrets intimately. To understand the human story of this region, we must travel far back, thousands of years, into a time when survival meant listening to the earth, not conquering it. The earliest known inhabitants of Death Valley were ancestors of the Timbisha Shoshone, a Native American people who have lived in the region for over 1,000 years, though archaeological evidence suggests that human presence here stretches back more than 9,000 years. How did people live in such a harsh place? The answer lies in deep ecological knowledge and remarkable adaptability. These early desert dwellers understood the valley's rhythms, when to gather, when to rest, where the precious seeps and springs were hidden. They didn't see Death Valley as barren. They saw it as a mosaic of life, if you knew where and how to look. They built shelters of willow and brush, carefully positioned to catch the fleeting breezes and avoid the fiercest heat. Their diets included mesquite pods, pine nuts, desert cucurbits, and the occasional jackrabbit or bighorn sheep. They used stone tools, woven baskets, and fire-hardened spears. Their footprints are preserved in ancient trails and petroglyphs scratched into canyon walls, marks left by people who thrived not despite the desert, but through deep respect for it. One of the most important survival strategies was mobility. Rather than remaining in one place, families would move with the seasons, traveling between lowland camps and cooler mountain areas. When water dried up in the valley floor, they would follow it uphill. When resources ran low in one area, they shifted to another, ensuring that no single part of the land was overused. Among the many cultural practices of the Timbisha Shoshone was a spiritual connection to the land. Mountains were more than rock. They were ancestors. Springs were sacred. The earth was alive. Even the harshest elements, sun, wind, salt, held meaning. Oral traditions spoke of journeys, creation stories, and lessons taught by the land itself. It's important to note that Death Valley wasn't a wasteland to these people. It was home. The name Death Valley was only imposed centuries later by outsiders who judged the land through the lens of hardship. But to the Timbisha and their ancestors, this place was a land of balance, not desolation. Their name for it, Timbisa, means rock paint. Though many of their practices have faded or evolved, the Timbisha Shoshone still live in and around Death Valley today. Their tribal lands now include a small reservation near Furnace Creek, and their voices remain vital in the ongoing story of this place. Their resilience, like the desert itself, endures. Modern archaeology continues to uncover evidence of these early inhabitants: grinding stones, ancient fire pits, arrowheads, and the outlines of seasonal shelters. Each find is a quiet echo, reminding us that human life in Death Valley is not a miracle, it's a memory. The legacy of these first footprints reminds us of something profound, that the earth has never been truly empty. Even in its quietest corners, life finds a way. People find a way. And in the heart of Death Valley, that way was carved not by force, but by humility, tradition, and deep listening. As we walk forward into the next chapter of Death Valley's human history, with its miners, dreamers, and outlaws, we carry with us the knowledge that long before ambition arrived, there was already wisdom here. Wisdom written in wind, in rock, in the whispers of the desert, and in the footsteps left behind. Part 2. The Gold Rush and Ghosts. Echoes of Greed and Abandonment. By the mid-19th century, a new kind of visitor arrived in Death Valley. One not guided by tradition or balance, but by dreams of fortune. The lure of precious metals swept across the American West like wildfire, and even the harshness of Death Valley couldn't extinguish the fever known as gold and silver rushes. While the valley had long been inhabited by those who understood its limits, the arrival of miners and prospectors marked a shift toward exploitation, ambition, and often disappointment. The first boom came in the late 1800s, when gold was discovered in the hills surrounding Death Valley. Towns sprang up almost overnight. Places like Rhyolite, Chloride City, Leadfield, and Panamint City. These were not the quiet villages of the Timbisha. They were raw, raucous, and restless. Rhyolite, near the eastern edge of the valley, quickly grew into one of the largest and most extravagant towns in the region. At its peak, it boasted electric lights, a stock exchange, newspapers, and a red light district. It was the image of prosperity carved into the desert. But that image was fleeting. The ore was never as rich as hoped. Within just a few years, mines dried up, investors vanished, and the people followed. Rhyolite, once a beacon of hope, became one of the West's most iconic ghost towns, its stone walls and crumbling bank vaults now haunting reminders of the thin line between ambition and illusion. In Panamint City, miners struck silver high in the mountains. The town was described as a place where drunken shootouts were as common as church services. At its peak, it housed thousands, but flash floods, legal troubles, and sheer inaccessibility eventually brought it to ruin. And then there was Leadfield, a classic case of boomtown deception. Promoters exaggerated the riches, printed brochures, and lured hundreds with false promises. The result? A town that barely survived a single season before being swallowed by the desert. But it wasn't just gold and silver. One of Death Valley's most enduring industrial legacies was borax mining. In the 1880s, 20-mule team wagons became iconic, hauling borax across punishing terrain from places like Harmony Borax Works. Though less glamorous than gold, borax brought steady employment and left behind lasting infrastructure. Yet the human cost was high. Men worked under brutal heat, often for little pay. Water had to be hauled in. Supplies were limited. Accidents were common. The desert didn't welcome the miners. It tolerated them, briefly. And when the minerals ran out, the desert took its silence back. Today, the skeletal remains of these towns draw curious travelers. Rusted mining equipment, collapsed cabins, and sun-bleached signposts mark the ambitions of the past. They speak of hardship and hope, of dreams pursued and often broken. Some structures stand defiant against time, stone facades half buried in sand, or rusted rail tracks twisted like scars. Others are barely more than impressions in the dust, but each ruin carries a story of men and women who believed the desert would make them rich, of temporary triumphs and quick disappearances, of how greed can carve as deep a wound as nature ever could. The ghosts of these settlements still linger, not in the spectral sense, but in the echo of footsteps in abandoned streets, in the whisper of wind through rusted beams, in the silence that follows the collapse of a dream. And in this way, the gold rush never fully left Death Valley. It simply changed shape, transforming from feverish hope to quiet history, from the clang of picks to the hush of wind. What remains today is not just ruin, but reminder that even in one of Earth's harshest places, people came searching, that the land gave little and took much, that time, like the desert, is patient, and that all things, gold, towns, and men, eventually fade, But the valley? The valley remains. Part 3. Tracks in the dust, roads, railways, and the rise of tourism. In the decades after the last miner abandoned his pickaxe and the last boomtown faded into silence, a different kind of traveler began to arrive in Death Valley. These visitors came not with gold pans or shovels, but with cameras, notebooks, and curiosity. They weren't chasing wealth, they were chasing wonder. The transformation of Death Valley from mining hub to national monument began in the early 20th century. At first, it was a destination for only the most adventurous, naturalists, geologists, and eccentric wanderers who were drawn to the valley's mystery and scale. But slowly, the desert's silence began to call to others as well. One of the key turning points in this transformation was the rise of the automobile. In the 1920s and 30s, newly paved roads and improved vehicles made once isolated places accessible to the public. Companies like the Pacific Coast Borax Company, which had operated the famous 20-mule team wagons, saw opportunity. They began promoting Death Valley as a tourist destination, even converting old mining infrastructure into rustic resorts. The most famous of these was the Furnace Creek Inn, opened in 1927. With palm-lined pools, shaded verandas, and a sense of desert luxury, it offered guests a way to experience the valley without suffering its extremes. It was a paradox. The harshest environment on the continent repackaged as a retreat. In 1933, Death Valley was declared a national monument by President Herbert Hoover, officially placing it under federal protection. Rangers were assigned, trails were marked, and visitor centers were constructed. The desert was still wild, but now it was also welcome. Railroads played a role too. Though no tracks were ever laid across the valley floor, nearby lines helped funnel tourists westward. From Los Angeles or Las Vegas, visitors could board trains to nearby hubs and continue by car into the park. The desert, once a barrier, became a destination. And with the rise of Hollywood, Death Valley found a new identity altogether. Its stark landscapes became stand-ins for alien planets and ancient wastelands in countless films. From science fiction to westerns, directors fell in love with its drama. Soon, even those who had never visited recognized its sun-baked hills and jagged cliffs. Today, millions come to Death Valley each year. They hike the canyons. They marvel at the salt flats. They photograph Zabriskie Point at sunrise. They stand at Badwater Basin and feel the weight of the heat. And to remember that sometimes the greatest riches are not in what we extract, but in what we observe. Because here, in the quiet heart of Death Valley, even a simple road becomes a story. Part 4. Shadows in the Sand. Legends, mysteries, and the unexplained. Even in a land shaped by science and weather, there are stories that resist explanation. In Death Valley, not everything fits neatly into geology textbooks or history books. Some stories drift between fact and folklore, between what is known and what is only whispered. One of the most enduring mysteries of Death Valley is the phenomenon of the sailing stones in Racetrack Playa. For decades, these large rocks, some weighing hundreds of pounds, were found with long trails behind them, as if they had slid across the dry lake bed unaided. No one had ever seen them move. Theories abounded: magnetic forces, wind, aliens, hoaxes. It wasn't until recent years that researchers, using time-lapse photography, observed the process. In rare conditions, thin sheets of ice form under the rocks, and gentle winds push them slowly across the mud. Mystery solved? Perhaps, But even with an explanation, the image of a stone drifting silently across the desert floor lingers in the imagination. Then there are the lost travelers, like the legendary Lost 49ers, a group of pioneers who, in 1849, took a disastrous shortcut and became stranded in the valley. Facing dehydration and death, they gave the place its infamous name. One man, William Manley, walked hundreds of miles to find help and return for the others, an act of heroism etched into the valley's legacy. Other tales speak of buried treasure, hidden mines, and phantom prospectors, figures seen in the distance who vanish when approached. Whether born of mirage, madness, or myth, these stories persist. And perhaps strangest of all is the legend of the Devil's Golf Course, a jagged expanse of salt formations so rough and twisted that only the devil could play golf on it. At sunset, when shadows deepen and the wind whistles through the salt towers, it's not hard to imagine something supernatural lingering. Death Valley also carries a strange, spiritual energy. Some visitors report feeling disoriented or watched in remote canyons. Others describe moments of unexpected clarity or deep calm. Scientists chalk it up to heat, isolation, and the mind's response to sensory extremes. But perhaps it's more than that. Perhaps the valley, with its silence and scars, invites us to feel things we usually ignore. In a world mapped by satellites and search engines, Death Valley retains a few secrets. Part 5. The Desert Endures. Preservation, National Park Status, and the Modern Era. Death Valley is a land shaped by ancient geology and human ambition. But the modern chapter of its story is one of preservation, a testament to the idea that some places are worth protecting, not just for their beauty, but for what they teach us. The push to preserve Death Valley began in the early 20th century. As mining declined and the scars of boomtowns faded, naturalists and conservationists began to recognize the region's unique value. In 1933, President Herbert Hoover designated the area as Death Valley National Monument. At the time, it was one of the largest protected regions in the country. The monument status was a beginning, but not a guarantee of preservation. For decades, mining continued within the monument's borders. Roads were carved into the wilderness, and development loomed. But voices advocating for greater protection grew louder. In 1994, a major milestone arrived. Death Valley was upgraded to Death Valley National Park under the California Desert Protection Act. The park's boundaries were expanded significantly, and most mining was banned. What was once seen only as a harsh frontier was finally recognized as a national treasure. Today, the park spans over 3.4 million acres, making it the largest national park in the contiguous United States. It contains a vast array of landscapes: salt flats, sand dunes, mountains, canyons, and badlands. It's not just a place of extremes, it's a place of diversity. Modern tourism has also reshaped Death Valley. Over 1 million people visit the park each year, drawn by its stark beauty, otherworldly vistas, and the challenge of its heat. Roads, campgrounds, visitor centers, and educational programs have made the park more accessible than ever. The National Park Service works tirelessly to balance access with conservation. Trails are maintained, sensitive areas are closed during recovery. Rangers educate visitors on the importance of leave no trace principles. Beyond the official efforts, A deeper shift is occurring. People are learning to appreciate Death Valley not as a punishment, but as a living classroom. Scientists study its geology to understand planetary evolution. Biologists examine how life adapts under stress. Artists and photographers find inspiration in its light and form. And visitors, whether here for a day or a lifetime, often leave changed. Because Death Valley endures. It endures sun and flood, myth and memory, greed and gratitude. It has endured long before we came, and it will endure long after we're gone. In the stillness of twilight, as the last rays of sun stretch across the salt flats, Chapter 4. The Valley of Secrets. Phenomena, Myths, and the Unknown. Part 1. The Sailing Stones. Rocks that moved on their own. There's a flat stretch of cracked earth in Death Valley, known as Racetrack Playa. It looks unremarkable at first glance, an ancient lakebed nestled between dark mountains. But scattered across its surface are large rocks, some weighing hundreds of pounds. And behind them, long, winding trails etched in the mud, as if the rocks had dragged themselves across the ground. No one had ever seen them move, yet the evidence was there. For decades, these mysterious stones puzzled scientists and sparked local legends. Some said they were moved by spirits. Others blamed magnetic fields or even mischievous pranksters. The phenomenon became known as the mystery of the sailing stones. The trails, some stretching over 1,500 feet, aren't random. They twist, curve, and sometimes run parallel before suddenly veering apart. Some rocks move in synchronized patterns. Others take their own meandering paths. Strangest of all, there are no visible disturbances, no human or animal footprints, no tire marks, just stone and trail. Theories abounded for decades. Some speculated strong winds could push the rocks. But how could wind move such heavy stones across flat ground? And why did they leave trails only on certain days? Others thought thin layers of ice might be involved. But in a place famous for its heat, ice seemed unlikely. Then, in 2014, a breakthrough came. Not through folklore, but through patient observation and technology. A team of researchers, including Richard Norris and his cousin James Norris, set up GPS trackers on a group of stones and monitored the playa with time-lapse cameras. What they discovered was astonishing. During rare winter rains, the dry lakebed would flood slightly. Overnight temperatures would plunge, forming a thin sheet of ice just a few millimeters thick across the water's surface. As the sun rose, the ice would begin to crack and break into large floating panels, with the rocks partially embedded. Then a gentle breeze, as little as 10 miles per hour, would push these ice panels, sliding the rocks forward across the soft, wet mud beneath. The result? Stones glided slowly, silently, leaving their signature trails. So, the sailing stones weren't magic. They were part of a delicate dance between. The story of the sailing stones is a reminder that, even in a desert famed for heat and desolation, nature holds surprises. That mystery doesn't always mean magic. It can mean waiting long enough to see the full picture. And it shows that some of the greatest wonders aren't flashy or loud. They're slow, subtle, and etched into the earth itself. At Racetrack Playa, the desert doesn't reveal its secrets all at once. But if you're patient, if you listen, you might just witness a stone that sails, a stone that moves when no one's watching, a story that drifts across time, carried by wind and wonder. Part 2. The Devil's Golf Course, where the earth speaks in cracks and crystals. Just south of Furnace Creek lies a jagged, menacing landscape with a name as dramatic as its appearance: the Devil's Golf Course. At first glance, this place looks like a field of shattered bone or broken coral. Sharp, irregular salt formations stretch for miles in every direction, forming a crust so hard and serrated that only the devil could play golf here. That's how the name came to be, given by early explorers in the 1930s, and few have questioned it since. This is no ordinary salt flat. While Badwater Basin nearby is flat and walkable, the Devil's Golf Course is brutal and alien, a testament to geological violence and time. Each salt spire is the result of ancient lakes that once covered this region, evaporated over tens of thousands of years. As groundwater continues to seep up from below, minerals like halite and gypsum crystallize, forming rough, crusted towers. Sunlight bakes them, wind sculpts them, and rare rainfall temporarily softens them, before the cycle begins again. The result is a surface so rugged and irregular that walking across it becomes a challenge. The salt pinnacles are razor sharp, rising several inches above ground and spaced unevenly like nature's minefield. Even seasoned hikers are warned. A fall here could mean serious injury. But it's not just what you see that leaves a mark. It's what you hear. On still days when the valley holds its breath, you might catch faint, eerie sounds rising from beneath your feet. Locals and visitors alike report whispers, cracks, and the soft popping of salt crystals expanding in the heat. Scientists explained it as thermal stress, salt adjusting to shifting temperatures. But in the middle of this desolate cathedral, the sound feels supernatural, like the land itself is alive, murmuring. And the experience doesn't end with sound. The colors here are subtle but hypnotic. Under the glare of midday sun, the crystals glint with white and silver. At dawn, they blush with soft pinks and oranges. In twilight, they seem to glow as if lit from within. It's a landscape that transforms hourly, revealing new textures and shadows as the light changes. Legends, of course, have grown around this place. Some say the formations are cursed, left behind by spirits who tried to escape the valley. Others believe it's a portal to another world, a place where time fractures and dimensions collide. To wander too far, they say, is to lose your way not just in space, but in thought. There are no official markers, no trails, no tourist-friendly walkways. The Devil's Golf Course is raw, unfiltered, and unchanged. It offers nothing except itself, a weight of geology pressing against the moment. And if you kneel just close enough, you might hear those cracks again, like whispers rising from the underworld, like time itself stretching and sighing beneath the crust. The Devil's Golf Course may be a name born of humor, but there's truth in the poetry. This place is not meant to be conquered. It's meant to be respected, observed, remembered. It reminds us that not all wonders come in the form of mountains or canyons or creatures. Some come as the earth's quiet voice, cracking through crystals, waiting for someone to listen. Here in Death Valley, even the salt has secrets. Part 3. The Ghosts of Harmony. Borax works, industry, isolation, and echoes of labor. Before Death Valley became a national park, before tourists took selfies on salt flats or scientists tracked stones with GPS, this land was a place of labor and hardship and grit. In the late 19th century, a white, crystalline substance known as borax was discovered in the valley's harsh environment. Used in everything from cleaning products to metallurgy, borax was a valuable commodity. But mining it in the searing heat and desolate terrain was anything but easy. The Harmony Borax Works, located near Furnace Creek, began operations in the 1880s. Here, under the blistering sun, men worked long hours harvesting borate minerals, crushing them and loading them into massive wagons bound for market. These weren't ordinary wagons. They were the legendary 20-mule teams, enormous wooden carriages pulled by teams of mules and horses across 165 miles of desert to reach the nearest railroad in Mojave. The 20-mule teams became a symbol of the American West, their silhouettes etched into history books and soap advertisements. But the reality was far from romantic. The work was brutal. Temperatures regularly soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Dust filled the lungs. Water was precious. Accidents were common. And yet, they endured. The Harmony Borax Works ran for only about 5 years, but in that time, it extracted nearly 3,000 tons of borax from Death Valley's soil. When richer sources were discovered elsewhere, the site was abandoned, but its legacy lingered. Today, the ruins of the plant remain, crumbling adobe walls, rusted machinery, and interpretive signs that hint at a time when this valley echoed with human ambition. You can still walk the old paths, see the remnants of furnaces, and imagine the creak of wooden wheels in the heat. But some say the workers never left. Stories persist of strange lights drifting over the ruins at night, of footsteps heard near the crumbled kilns, of shadows where there should be none. Rangers have reported cold spots on the warmest nights. Visitors have described the feeling of being watched. Whether ghost stories or tricks of the imagination, Harmony Borax Works remains a place of echoes, a place where human labor met the Earth's resistance and left a scar. It's not just a historical site, it's a memorial to the grit and ghosts of those who came before. A place where profit met punishment. Part 4. The Singing Sand Dunes, Nature's Mysterious Music. Part 5. Desert Lights, Shadow Figures, and the Mirage of Truth. In a landscape as extreme and surreal as Death Valley, it's no wonder the line between reality and imagination can blur. For decades, visitors and locals alike have reported unexplainable phenomena, odd lights, shadowy figures, and encounters that seem to stretch beyond the bounds of the ordinary. Let's start with the lights. On moonless nights, especially in the wide, open expanses of places like Badwater Basin or the Mesquite Flat sand dunes, faint orbs of light have been spotted hovering just above the horizon. They flicker, they dance, and then they vanish without a sound. Some describe them as glowing blue or green. Others insist they move with intelligence, zigzagging across the salt flats or weaving through rock formations. Scientists suggest these may be caused by piezoelectric discharges, a phenomenon where quartz crystals under stress emit tiny flashes of light. The desert, with its tectonic activity and mineral-rich terrain, could feasibly generate such effects. But there's no firm proof, and those who've witnessed the lights say it feels like something more than geology. Then there are the shadow figures. Stories of human-like shapes, tall, dark, and silent, are whispered in the campsites and ranger stations. Seen most often near Zabriskie Point or Dante's View, these figures reportedly appear at twilight, standing still at the edges of vision. Turn your head, and they're gone. But sometimes people claim they reappear closer, watching, always silent. Skeptics point to natural illusions, the intense contrast between bright rock and long shadows, the way heat and light distort depth perception. And yet, there's a persistence to these tales, enough that even seasoned hikers admit they sometimes feel they're not alone. And in the heat, mirages are not just common, they're constant. Light bending through layers of hot and cool air creates shimmering pools on the horizon, or mountains that seem to float. Entire valleys shift shape under the sun's influence. What you see isn't always what exists. But sometimes it's not about illusion. Sometimes it's about atmosphere. The desert plays tricks on your senses, not with malice, but with mystery. In the dry stillness, even your heartbeat feels louder. A shift of sand sounds like footsteps. A flicker in the corner of your eye becomes a presence. And suddenly, and then there's the most chilling tale of all, the traveler who never left. It's a local legend. They say a man once came to Death Valley seeking silence, solitude, and escape. He was never seen again, but hikers swear they sometimes find perfect boot prints in places no one could reach without days of travel. A single campsite, undisturbed, with a journal half-written, a whisper caught on camera. Is it just a story? Perhaps. But stories grow where the ground is fertile. And here, in this quiet furnace of shifting sand and time, truth and myth intertwine. Because in Death Valley, the real and the unreal do not live in opposition. They coexist, like light and shadow, like silence and song, like the desert and those who dare to walk through it. Here, the land may seem still, but beneath its surface, mysteries stir, and above the horizon, the lights still dance. You only have to believe long enough to see them. Chapter 5. Ancient Footprints. Human History in the Valley. Part 1. The First Peoples of the Valley. Long before Death Valley bore the ominous name that evokes images of scorching sun and silent stone, it was a living place, a home, a sanctuary, a challenge. For thousands of years before recorded history, human feet walked across this land, leaving no written record, but many enduring traces. These were the first inhabitants of what we now call Death Valley. People who not only survived the extremes, but who understood them intimately. Archaeological evidence points to human presence in the region going back over 10,000 years. Stone tools, arrowheads, and ancient hearths have been discovered in caves and dry lake beds, remnants of nomadic bands who hunted, gathered, and moved with the seasons. These early peoples would have known a greener valley, when Ice Age rains fed ancient lakes, and where now barren salt flats once shimmered with water. As the climate shifted and water retreated, the land grew harsher. But life didn't vanish. Instead, it adapted. Over time, these early groups gave rise to the Timbisha Shoshone, a people whose roots in the valley stretch back centuries. Unlike explorers who saw the desert as lifeless, the Timbisha saw it as layered, sacred, and alive. They called the valley Timpisa, which means rock paint, a reference to the red ochre they used in ceremonies and art. Their villages were often nestled near natural springs, in canyons where mesquite trees and wildlife offered resources. Their homes were constructed of willow branches and brush, angled carefully to maximize airflow and protection from the sun. Their way of life was in harmony with the land's rhythms, following plant cycles, animal migrations, and the whisper of desert winds. The Timbisha hunted bighorn sheep, gathered piñón nuts, and made flour from mesquite pods. They knew where to find water in hidden springs and seeps, and how to read the desert for signs of coming weather. In the hottest months, they would move into higher elevations, returning only when the valley began to cool again. Perhaps most remarkably, their relationship with Death Valley wasn't built on conquest or defiance, but on respect. Stories passed down through generations told of the desert's moods, its dangers, and its gifts. The desert wasn't to be beaten, it was to be understood. But this harmony was disrupted in the 19th century. As explorers and settlers pushed westward, they brought a different view of the land. To many, Death Valley was a curiosity, an obstacle, a mystery, or a potential source of wealth. And as is so often the case in history, the arrival of outsiders changed everything. In 1849, during the California Gold Rush, a group of pioneers, later known as the 49ers, attempted to cross Death Valley in search of a shortcut to the gold fields. Ill-prepared and unfamiliar with the terrain, they suffered greatly. One group, the Bennett Arcane Party, became trapped for weeks. When they finally escaped, legend says one man turned back and said, "Goodbye, Death Valley," giving the place its enduring name. For the Timbisha, these events were more than just stories. They were the beginning of dispossession. As the U.S. government expanded westward, lands were seized and indigenous ways of life were marginalized. The Timbisha were forced to relocate repeatedly, even though their ancestral homes lay in the very heart of the national park that was later created. Yet, they endured. In the 20th century, after decades of struggle, the Timbisha Shoshone tribe was finally recognized by the U.S. government. In 2000, they were granted rights to a portion of their homeland within Death Valley National Park, establishing the Timbisha village near Furnace Creek. It was a moment of justice, delayed but not denied. Today, the Timbisha continue to live and thrive in the valley. They are stewards of the land, keepers of stories, and living proof that Death Valley, for all its harshness, is not empty. It is not dead. It is home. As we walk through this land, let us remember, every cracked rock and shifting dune was once seen through the eyes of those who knew it best, and their footprints, though faded, are never truly gone. They walk with us still, in silence and sand, under the same sky they once watched, and the valley remembers them. Part 2. Gold Rush and the Outsiders. When the valley wasn't quiet anymore. The story of Death Valley took a dramatic turn in the mid-1800s when the rumble of wagons and the hope of gold began to echo across the American West. The peaceful solitude once preserved by the Timbisha Shoshone was interrupted by a wave of fortune seekers chasing the promise of prosperity. Among these were the ill-fated pioneers of 1849, known famously as the 49ers. The California gold rush had ignited a wildfire of migration. Tens of thousands of people from as far away as Europe and China flooded westward in search of gold. Among them was a group attempting to reach the Sierra Nevada by cutting through what was then a largely unmapped and misunderstood desert. Their journey would forever shape the identity of this place. In the winter of 1849-1850, a group called the Bennett Arcane Party found themselves trapped in the hostile terrain of what we now call Death Valley. With little water, dwindling supplies, and no clear direction, they struggled to survive. Two members, William Lewis Manley and John Rogers, hiked over the mountains in a desperate attempt to find help. Miraculously, they returned with supplies and guided the party to safety. It was during this harrowing escape that a member of the group reportedly turned back and said, "Goodbye, Death Valley," a name that would stick forever. The valley's new name cast a dark shadow, but it also invited curiosity. Soon the trickle of pioneers turned into a flood of prospectors. The 1850s and 1860s saw the rise of mining camps, especially as the region was found to be rich, not in gold, but in other minerals, particularly borax. Borax, known as white gold, became the valley's most significant commercial resource. In the 1880s, borax mining took center stage, with large-scale operations like the Harmony Borax Works. These remote and dangerous jobs drew in a transient population of laborers, many of whom endured blistering heat and brutal conditions to extract the valuable mineral. To transport borax across the desert, the now famous 20-mule teams were developed, wagon trains that carried tons of borax over hundreds of miles to railroads. The impact of this era was profound. Temporary towns sprang up, only to vanish when the minerals were exhausted. Names like Ryan, Greenwater, and Skidoo appeared on maps, then disappeared as quickly as they came. With them went saloons, general stores, and hastily built shacks, all remnants of a population that lived on hope and little else. For the Timbisha, this was a time of deep loss. The influx of settlers disrupted traditional migration routes, dried up water sources, and introduced diseases. By the early 1900s, the mining boom had begun to wane, but its legacy remained. Abandoned equipment rusted in the sun, mine shafts scarred the landscape, and stories of fortune and failure echoed in the canyons. But this chapter of history wasn't all hardship. Some figures from this time brought a different energy to the desert. One such character was Walter Scott, better known as Death Valley Scotty. A showman and conman, Scotty claimed to have a secret gold mine in the valley and used the myth to secure funding from wealthy investors. One of them, Chicago insurance magnate Albert Johnson, was so enchanted by the desert and Scotty's charisma that he built a grand home called Scotty's Castle in the Grapevine Mountains. Though Scotty had no real mine, the friendship between the two men became legendary. Today, Scotty's Castle stands as a testament to the oddball charm of Death Valley's history. Part deception, part devotion, entirely unforgettable. By the time Death Valley was declared a national monument in 1933, the rush was over. The miners had gone, but the stories they left behind became woven into the identity of the land. The outsiders who came brought upheaval and change, but they also added new chapters to the valley's legacy. Tales of perseverance, folly, greed, and friendship. The desert, for all its silence, remembered them. Because in Death Valley, every footprint tells a story. And some stories never fade, no matter how hot the sand or how long the wind blows. Part 3. From boomtowns to ghost trails, the desert remembers. As the initial frenzy of borax and gold mining faded, Death Valley began to change. The wild energy that had once pulsed through its canyons and valleys slowly quieted. By the early 1900s, many of the boomtowns that had sprung up almost overnight were vanishing just as quickly. The promise of riches had drawn in thousands, but only dust and rust remained. Mining towns like Skidoo, Greenwater, and Keen Wonder once buzzed with activity. They had post offices, saloons, and even newspapers. In Skidoo's case, the town had electricity and a water pipeline from a spring miles away, a technical marvel for the time. But like many places in the desert, they weren't built to last. As the minerals ran dry and prices fell, the towns emptied out. Today, only weathered timbers, collapsed shafts, and the occasional rusted artifact hint at the lives once lived here. These ghost towns became silent archives, each one a chapter in the greater story of Death Valley's transformation. Some were destroyed by time. Others were reclaimed by the desert, their buildings swallowed by shifting sands or dismantled by scavengers and storms. But some ruins remain, standing like forgotten sentinels under the unforgiving sun. Amid the decline, the desert didn't become empty. It simply changed audiences. No longer the exclusive domain of miners and mule teams, it began to attract a new kind of visitor: the curious, the artistic, and the scientific. Photographers ventured in to capture the light and shadow. Writers arrived to find metaphors in the landscape. Geologists began studying its ancient formations, and slowly, a movement began to preserve the valley, not for what it could provide in gold or borax, but for what it already was: a vast, unique, and irreplaceable wilderness. One key moment came in 1933, when President Herbert Hoover designated Death Valley a national monument. This was a milestone that marked a shift in how Americans viewed wild spaces, from obstacles to conquer to landscapes worth protecting. With this new designation came efforts to study the land, manage tourism, and begin restoring the damage left behind by years of exploitation. The National Park Service took over management of the valley and began surveying its history. They documented mines, stabilized ruins, and even rehabilitated trails once used by borax teams. Interpretive signs and visitor centers were built to help travelers understand the stories embedded in the rock and sand. One standout story from this era is the legacy of Marta Beckett, a dancer and artist who stumbled upon an abandoned building in the tiny desert town of Death Valley Junction in the 1960s. She transformed the crumbling hall into the Amargosa Opera House, painting murals of a phantom audience and performing one-woman shows for years. Her devotion to art in the middle of nowhere attracted international attention and helped revive interest in the desert's cultural significance. These narratives of preservation, of reinterpretation, of reinvention are just as vital as those of the 49ers and miners. They show that even after the rushes ended, Death Valley continued to evolve, its silence filled not only with memory, but with meaning. Today, visitors wander through places like Rhyolite or Chloride City, snapping photos of broken bottle walls or rusted cars. They hike to old mine entrances and read plaques about the men and women who once gambled everything on a dream. And in doing so, they become part of the valley's ongoing story. Because Death Valley doesn't forget. It remembers those who came, those who left, and those who dared to imagine something more in the stillness. And in that remembering, the desert continues to speak, not with words, but with ruins, with silence, with the wind whispering through empty door frames and the creak of old wood under an unforgiving sky. The boomtowns may have vanished, but their echoes remain. In Death Valley, even ghosts have footprints. Part 4. Building roads, drawing maps. The making of a destination. As the 20th century progressed, Death Valley's identity began to shift yet again. No longer just a forgotten landscape of failed mines and fading dreams, it was increasingly being reimagined as a destination, a place not only to survive, but to explore, to understand, to visit. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It required roads and maps, and a new kind of infrastructure that would open up the valley's vastness to the curious public. In the 1920s and 30s, the rise of the American automobile made road trips a national pastime. As tourists began craving adventure and natural beauty, government and private developers took notice. Early scenic roads were carved into the valley floor, following old wagon trails. These were not easy projects. The terrain was rough, the heat unforgiving, equipment often failed, yet progress moved forward. Roads like the one to Dante's View, which offers a breathtaking overlook of the valley floor, became key attractions. Paved routes through Furnace Creek, Stovepipe Wells, and Badwater Basin brought travelers to once remote sites. Alongside these new roads came campsites, ranger stations, and lodges, each one a marker of the valley's evolving accessibility. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, a public work relief program during the Great Depression, played a pivotal role in this development. Young men from across the country were stationed in the valley. They built stone shelters, rest stops, and hiking trails. They worked through blistering summers and bitter winds, reshaping the desert not with gold pans or drills, but with picks and shovels. Their craftsmanship still stands today. The rockwork at Zabriskie Point, the stone steps in Mosaic Canyon. These are monuments not just to engineering, but to a national shift in how landscapes were valued. As maps were redrawn and guidebooks written, the names of places in Death Valley took on new meaning. Places once known only to miners or native peoples, Golden Canyon, Devil's Golf Course, Artist's Drive, became household names among park-goers. Photography books captured the bizarre beauty of the terrain. Postcards featured sunsets and salt flats, and gradually, an entire industry grew around the idea of seeing the desolation. Tourism came with its contradictions. On one hand, it brought revenue, awareness, and support for conservation. On the other, it introduced cars, crowds, and environmental pressure. Trails that had lain undisturbed for centuries saw new foot traffic. Wildlife encountered noise and light they weren't adapted to, and fragile geologic features were sometimes damaged by well-meaning but unaware visitors.
Still, the Park Service and preservationists worked to strike a balance. Educational programs were created, signs warned of delicate ecosystems, and ranger-led hikes invited visitors to not just look, but to learn. Perhaps the most telling transformation of this era wasn't in infrastructure or attendance, but in perception. Death Valley was no longer the place to avoid. It was the place to experience, to photograph, to write about. to return to. By the 1990s, Death Valley had been elevated from a national monument to a national park, recognizing not just its uniqueness, but its importance. This designation expanded its protected area, increased funding, and brought international attention. What began as a place of survival, then exploitation, had now become a symbol of resilience, wonder, and quiet beauty. Roads brought the people, maps guided them, but it was the valley itself, its silence, its extremes, its stubborn endurance, that made them stay. And as each new visitor leaves their footprints in the sand, they unknowingly follow a trail drawn long ago. A trail of history, of vision, of maps once sketched by hand under the heat of an unforgiving sun. Death Valley became a destination, but more than that, it became a story that people chose to step into, again and again.
Part 5. Legacy and Echoes. How the Past Lives On. As the 21st century unfolds, the layers of Death Valley's human past continue to ripple through its vast and arid landscape, not only in crumbling ruins or museum displays, but in the daily experiences of those who wander its trails and wonder at its mysteries. History does not sleep here, it lingers. Each year, historians, archaeologists, and descendants of native peoples return to the valley, not just to study it, but to remember it. Oral traditions are shared beside petroglyphs. Students hike into slot canyons carrying tablets and notebooks. And tribal elders gather to reclaim stories once threatened with silence. The Timbisha Shoshone tribe, whose ancestors lived here long before the maps and monuments, continue to assert their presence, not as relics of the past, but as stewards of the future. In 2000, after years of advocacy, a portion of ancestral land near Furnace Creek was returned to the tribe under federal trust. Today they work in partnership with the National Park Service, offering cultural education, preserving sacred spaces, and ensuring that the valley's first voices are never lost beneath the roar of tourism. Elsewhere, the remnants of mining towns are carefully stabilized. Interpretive signs mark historic borax sites, telling stories of Chinese laborers, European immigrants, and desert dreamers. Scotty's Castle, once a beacon of eccentric desert luxury, is slowly being restored after flood damage, its halls echoing again with guided tours that blend fact, folklore, and architectural wonder. Park rangers play a crucial role in this preservation of narrative. Their talks and treks aren't just about geology or climate, but about the people, their courage, failures, adaptation, and sometimes their refusal to adapt. School groups walk where miners once toiled, writers find inspiration where pioneers collapsed, filmmakers set scenes where real drama unfolded long before cameras arrived. Digital tools now augment these experiences. QR codes link visitors to archived photographs, augmented reality apps recreate ghost towns, and online oral history projects allow distant audiences to hear the voices of those who once called the valley home. Yet even with all this access, the valley holds back. There are stories still buried, quite literally. New archaeological surveys continue to uncover stone tools, ancient hearths, and forgotten footpaths. Some are thousands of years old. Others may rewrite what we thought we knew about migration, trade, or adaptation in extreme environments. And then there are the metaphors, the way Death Valley speaks to something beyond its borders, to resilience in a time of change, to beauty in unexpected forms, to silence as a kind of music. Travelers often report a deep sense of reflection after time here, as if the desert in its quiet had reminded them of something they'd forgotten about themselves. It's no surprise that Death Valley has become a spiritual destination for some. Artists set up canvases beneath the scorching sky. Poets scribble in the shade of rocks. Pilgrims of all kinds come not just for the photos, but for the feeling, the sense of scale, of time, of insignificance and belonging all at once. The park's visitor numbers have grown, but so has awareness. Conversations about climate, water, indigenous rights, and conservation have taken root in the very sand once thought barren. In Death Valley, the future is always tied to the past, and the past is always speaking. It speaks through rusted rail tracks and ancient charcoal kilns, through the careful words of a ranger or the chant of an elder, through wind, heat, and the crunch of footsteps on gravel paths once walked by gold seekers and storytellers alike. So, what is the legacy of Death Valley's human story? It's not a single tale. It's a woven tapestry of survival and struggle, of silence and song, of myths that became maps, and memories that became monuments. And through it all, the land watches and waits. In this place where time doesn't rush but lingers, so too do we linger, listening. Because in Death Valley, history doesn't fade, it echoes.
Chapter 6. The Valley Beyond Time. Reflections in Silence. Part 1. The Valley as Mirror. What it teaches us about ourselves. There are places in the world that feel like mirrors, not because they reflect your face, but because they reflect your soul. Death Valley, in all its stillness and silence, is one of those places. Here, the land does not beg for attention. It does not boast or scream or clamor to be noticed. It waits, and in that waiting, something begins to happen. Not to the desert, but to you. You arrive with thoughts, worries, noise. You come carrying the burdens of your modern life, messages unread, deadlines looming, memories half-healed. But slowly, as the sun climbs higher and the world around you grows quieter, your mind does the same. In the face of such vastness, your problems shrink, your pace slows. You begin to notice things, the way a shadow stretches across salt, the hush of morning wind, the exact moment when night gives way to day. Death Valley becomes less a destination and more a meditation. It teaches you the power of presence. To stand on the edge of Badwater Basin, surrounded by nothing but white salt and endless sky, is to feel both insignificant and deeply connected. It is to realize that you are not the center of the universe, but still, somehow, a part of it. This is a place that humbles and uplifts in equal measure. The mountains are taller than your fears. The silence is deeper than your grief. And the sky, so wide, so infinite, has room for every thought you've ever tried to bury. Visitors often say they come for the scenery but leave with something else. Clarity, stillness, a new sense of scale, not just in miles or heat, but in meaning. Because when you are alone with the land, truly alone, you begin to hear your own voice again, not the one molded by expectation or anxiety, but the quieter one underneath. It speaks in memories, in questions long postponed, in realizations that arrive not like lightning, but like dawn.
In Death Valley, you learn to listen again. To the desert, to the sky, to yourself. It's no coincidence that many who come here seek something more than beauty. They come looking for peace, or direction, or perhaps nothing at all. And that nothingness becomes the point, because here absence becomes presence. Emptiness becomes fullness.
Some walk the dunes and cry without knowing why. Some stand at Zabriskie Point and suddenly remember something important. Some stare at the stars over Mesquite Flat and feel for the first time in years truly small, and that smallness is a relief. The desert does not judge. It does not interrupt. It simply is. And in its being, it invites you to be, too. Not to achieve, not to perform, not to fix or solve or hustle, just to be. And that, in itself, is transformative. So what does Death Valley teach us about ourselves? That we are not our worries, that we are not our emails or errands or achievements, that beneath all the layers we build to survive, there is something simpler and more enduring. Stillness, wonder, gratitude. Death Valley does not change you with force. It changes you by showing you who you already are, beneath the noise. You might leave with sand in your shoes or sun on your skin, but what stays with you is something quieter, a reminder that silence is sacred, that space can be healing, and that sometimes the best way to find your way is to stand still. In this vast valley where time slows down, your thoughts do, too, and in the hush of that pause, many discover a surprising truth. They are okay. They are enough. They are here. And that is everything. Part 2. Echoes of Time. Memory, myth, and the stories we leave behind. In Death Valley, time does not move in straight lines. It folds, it loops, it echoes. The desert has a strange way of holding on to moments long after they've passed. A footprint in the sand may vanish with the wind, but the feeling of standing there, that stays. A whisper spoken into the rocks might never be heard again, but somehow it lingers. This is a place full of ghosts, not the kind that haunt, but the kind that remind. Every trail here has been walked before, by miners, by wanderers, by indigenous elders, and by those who simply wanted to disappear. Each left something behind: a carving in stone, a rusted canteen, a worn boot sole, a story never told aloud. The valley collects these fragments the way it collects wind, quietly, patiently, forever. It remembers. It remembers the Timbisha Shoshone, whose ancestors lived not just in this land, but with it. They didn't try to change the desert. They listened to it. They followed the rhythm of seasons, the path of the stars, the wisdom of plants and stone. They knew that stories were not only told, they were felt, passed down through hands and wind and silence. It remembers the gold-rush dreamers who chased fortune into the dunes. Many found only sunstroke and silence. Some found madness. And a few, oddly enough, found peace. It remembers the old borax wagons, creaking across the salt flats, pulled by mules and grit. It remembers the soldiers who trained for foreign wars by marching in domestic heat. It remembers the wanderers who built homes from scrap and sky, seeking solitude or salvation, or both. These stories are not written in books. They're written in the folds of the hills, in the way a path veers slightly from where it should, in the bones of an old cabin slowly returning to dust. And the desert? It holds them all, without judgment. You can feel these echoes when you walk alone through Mosaic Canyon, when the wind shifts and you catch a scent you can't name, when the light bends just right, and you see not just the land, but the lives layered into it. In these moments, Death Valley becomes more than a landscape. It becomes...
And that's the beauty of this place. It doesn't just reflect your soul in the moment. It offers it a place to rest, and maybe, if you're lucky, to speak. Because we all carry myths about ourselves, about the world, about what matters. Death Valley has a way of peeling those myths back, of showing you which stories are true and which were never yours to begin with. It invites you to rewrite them, not with ink, not with declarations, but with silence, with breath, with presence. In a world obsessed with legacy, Death Valley reminds us that some of the most powerful stories are the quietest. A stone left balanced on another. A moment of awe shared with no one but the sky. A realization that what you feared most wasn't real. Here, memory isn't about keeping things. It's about releasing them. Letting them settle into the dust. Letting the wind take them, letting the land hold them. So what stories will you leave behind? Not the ones you planned, not the ones you posted, but the ones that shaped you quietly beneath the surface, the ones that changed your breath, your pace, your gaze. Death Valley holds space for all of them. It is vast enough for every secret, gentle enough for every wound, strong enough to carry every unfinished sentence you've ever whispered into the dark. This is the echo. This is the gift. And when you return, days, years, or lifetimes from now, you might find that nothing has changed. And everything has. Part 3. The Sacredness of Space. Finding stillness in a restless world. Not every desert is sacred, but every sacred place feels, in some way, like a desert. Vast, quiet, demanding your presence. In a world that moves faster every day, Death Valley moves at the speed of sand. It asks nothing of you but attention, and in return, it offers a kind of peace that's hard to find elsewhere. This isn't the peace of comfort. It's the peace of perspective, of standing under a sky so wide it makes your thoughts feel small, of walking among rocks older than language, of hearing your own breath in a place where nothing interrupts it. Here, Space is not empty, it's essential. The vastness between landmarks, the silence between words, the gap between one footstep and the next, these are not voids, they are invitations. Invitations to pause, to look inward, to ask questions you forgot you had. When we talk about stillness, we often imagine inaction, but in Death Valley, stillness is alive. It shimmers in heat mirages, it pulses in stars, it moves without motion. And in that stillness, many find something sacred, not because of a ritual or a religion, but because presence, in its purest form, is holy. You don't need to believe in anything to feel reverence here. You only need to stop long enough to notice. Notice the way the horizon curves, the way sand shapes wind and wind shapes stone, the way time seems to hang in the air, thick as heat. In a restless world, Death Valley is a reminder that stillness is not stagnation, that emptiness is not lack, that space can be sacred, and that sometimes the most profound journeys happen when you don't move at all.
Chapter 7. Beneath the Silence. The Hidden Heart of Death Valley. Part 1. The Hidden Life. Flora and fauna you never knew existed. In the blistering quiet of Death Valley, where most see only heat and emptiness, a secret world pulses beneath the surface. A hidden network of life, perfectly adapted to survive on the edge of existence. While tourists often marvel at the extremes of temperature or the vast silence, the desert itself holds a quiet miracle. It is alive. This is not life as we know it in gardens or forests. It doesn't bloom with loud color or move in obvious ways. Instead, the life here whispers, waits, and adapts. Start with the plants. You might think nothing could grow in a place where the soil is laced with salt and rain may not fall for years. But the creosote bush thrives here, with roots that reach deep and leaves coated in resin to trap moisture. These ancient shrubs are not just survivors, they're witnesses. Some creosote rings are estimated to be over 11,000 years old. Then there are the desert holly and pickleweed, thriving in saline soils near Badwater Basin. Their leaves reflect sunlight like mirrors, reducing water loss. The desert marigold, despite its fragile look, bursts forth after rain with golden petals, lighting the valley like scattered sun. But even more extraordinary are the animals. Most are nocturnal, emerging only under the cover of darkness when the temperatures drop. The kangaroo rat, for instance, never drinks water. It survives entirely off moisture extracted from seeds, and its kidneys are so efficient that its urine is almost solid. Then there's the desert bighorn sheep. They navigate the sharp ridges and high canyons, leaping across stone with ease. These sheep can go without water for days, rehydrating rapidly when they find a spring. Their horns grow in spirals, telling the story of survival one ring at a time. Small reptiles dominate the daytime. Sidewinder rattlesnakes move in an S-shaped pattern, lifting their bodies off the hot sand to minimize contact. Desert iguanas and chuckwallers hide in rocky crevices, emerging briefly to bask and feed. They regulate their body temperature with precision, a dance between shadow and sun. And then, deep in the isolated pools of Salt Creek and Devil's Hole, lives the pupfish. These tiny, iridescent creatures are relics of a wetter past, when great lakes covered this desert. As the waters receded, the pupfish became trapped in shrinking habitats. Now, each population is genetically distinct, adapted to different salinity and temperature levels. The devil's hole pupfish, critically endangered, exists in a single, deep water-filled cavern. Insects, too, thrive here. Beetles scurry across dunes, ants construct elaborate underground homes, and butterflies emerge after spring rains. Everything in this ecosystem is part of a delicate balance. When it rains, life explodes in brief, brilliant cycles. Desert wildflowers bloom in superblooms, drawing pollinators and birdlife. And then, just as quickly, it fades, retreating into seed and silence. Birds like the common raven and roadrunner are regular residents. Migratory birds pass through in spring and fall, drawn by oases like Furnace Creek. Even at the hottest times, life persists because it has learned how to vanish, how to pause, how to endure. There is no waste here. Nothing is taken for granted. A single drop of water might mean survival. A shadow at midday might be the difference between life and death. To truly appreciate this hidden life, you must look with patience. Sit still long enough, and you might see movement where before there was none. A shimmer in the heat might become a lizard. A flicker of shade might reveal a bird. The desert rewards those who listen, because beneath the silence there is a pulse, and in that pulse lives a world more complex, more ancient, and more tenacious than we often realize. Death Valley may seem empty, but it is, in fact, full, overflowing, with life that has learned to hide in plain sight, with stories etched in claw marks and seed husks, with wisdom born of endurance. To walk through this land is not just to witness survival, but to be humbled by it, because here, against all odds, life does not just exist. It thrives, quietly, brilliantly, relentlessly. Part 2. Creatures of the Edge. Wildlife in the harshest habitat. When most people picture Death Valley, they imagine lifeless heat, barren rock, skeletal trees, and endless sun-scorched salt flats. But those who look closer find that life has not only survived here, it has adapted in ways that seem almost impossible. The creatures of Death Valley are not ordinary. They are specialists, survivors, masters of the edge. Let's begin at the lowest point, Badwater Basin. Here, brine flies, tiny insects barely noticeable to the eye, form the base of a unique food web. Where there's salty water, even if fleeting, there is life. Killdeer and other shorebirds arrive in the right season to feast on these minute creatures, sometimes traveling thousands of miles just for a few weeks of feeding. In nearby salt marshes and spring-fed pools, you'll find the elusive Death Valley pupfish. This tiny blue fish is one of the most remarkable animals in North America. Trapped in these desert springs after ancient lakes dried up, the pupfish now survive in isolated habitats, often with water temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, and salinity levels that would kill most freshwater species. There are fewer than 200 of these fish in some populations, and yet they persist, flashing silver and blue as they dart through the warm shallows.
Then there's the kangaroo rat, an animal that's practically a miracle of desert engineering. It doesn't drink water, not ever. Instead, it gets all its hydration from seeds, which it stores in underground burrows. Its kidneys are so efficient that it excretes nearly solid urine to conserve moisture. At night, it emerges from its cool tunnels to forage, avoiding the deadly heat of the sun. Desert reptiles abound as well. The sidewinder rattlesnake, named for its unique method of movement, glides sideways across the sand, leaving a distinct pattern behind. This allows it to minimize contact with the hot surface. Horned lizards, with their spiny armor and perfect camouflage, freeze in place when approached, blending seamlessly with the desert floor. And the desert iguana, one of the few creatures comfortable basking in extreme midday heat, lounges on sun-baked rocks as temperatures soar. Birds find ways to thrive too. The greater roadrunner, often associated with cartoon fame, is a fierce and efficient predator. It dashes across the land hunting insects, lizards, and even small snakes. Ravens, but not all wildlife here is so visible. Nocturnal creatures like bats, foxes, and owls emerge under cover of darkness. The kit fox, small, elusive, and sharp-eared, hunts silently across the dunes. Bats swoop through canyons, feeding on moths and insects invisible to the human eye. Owls, with their haunting calls, rule the cool night skies. Even insects and arachnids have carved out niches in this demanding environment. The vinegaroon, also known as the whip scorpion, sprays acetic acid, essentially vinegar, when threatened. Tarantulas roam during mating season in fall, and various beetles dig into the sand during the day to avoid the heat. The common thread among all these animals is adaptation. Each has evolved over millennia to fit a specific corner of this harsh world. Some rely on burrows, others on nocturnal habits. Some avoid heat entirely, while others embrace it. Together, they form a surprisingly rich and dynamic web of life. And while this desert may seem static, its wildlife is anything but. Creatures move in and out with the seasons. Rainfall, when it happens, brings sudden blooms of insects, which in turn bring birds. A shift in temperature can open or close entire habitats. And though few in number, the species here are deeply interconnected. This hidden network is delicate. Changes in climate, water access, or human development can tip the balance. Some pupfish populations have nearly vanished due to groundwater pumping. Invasive species, both plant and animal, threaten native ecosystems. And increasing visitation means more pressure on already stressed environments. But conservation efforts are ongoing. Protected under the National Park Service, many of these species benefit from active monitoring, habitat restoration, and research. Indigenous knowledge is also playing a larger role, with tribal voices helping to guide protection efforts for these ancestral lands. So when you walk through Death Valley and feel like you're alone, remember, you're not. There's a world watching from the shadows, listening from burrows, waiting for nightfall. This is not a dead place. It is a living mosaic, fragile, fierce, and unforgettable. In the silence between footsteps, there are hearts beating. In the cracks between stones, there is life pushing upward. And in Death Valley's most unforgiving corners, nature continues to survive. Sometimes, even to thrive.
Part 3. Surviving the extremes. How plants endure the heat in Death Valley. Survival is a language spoken in whispers, shadows, and silence. And nowhere is that language more profound than in the world of desert plants. At first glance, the valley may seem empty, devoid of greenery, absent of bloom. But for those who know where and when to look, a hidden botanic world reveals itself. It's a world of patience, resilience, and ingenious design. Desert plants endure some of the most punishing conditions on Earth. Relentless sun, baking soil, minimal rainfall, and high salinity. To live here is to adapt, and Death Valley's flora has done just that. Let's begin with the creosote bush, perhaps the desert's most iconic plant. It's hardy, ancient, and seemingly unbothered by the heat. Its small, waxy leaves help minimize water loss, and it exudes a distinct earthy scent after rain, a rare and sacred aroma in the desert. Some creosote colonies are thousands of years old, cloning themselves over time into large circular stands known as creosote rings. Then there's the mesquite tree, with roots that plunge deep, sometimes more than 80 feet into the ground. It accesses moisture no other plant can reach. Its branches offer vital shade for animals and humans alike, and its seed pods were once a key food source for native peoples. In Death Valley, mesquite grows where water flows underground, whispering the presence of life below the surface. Cacti, though not as common in Death Valley as in Arizona or New Mexico, still stake their claim. The beaver-tail cactus, named for its flat pads, blooms in spring with bright magenta flowers that seem almost out of place amid the beige and brown. Its thick, water-storing pads and defensive spines embody desert logic. Store what you need, protect what you have. Ephemerals, short-lived wildflowers, are the desert's most dramatic expression of life. They spend most of their time hidden as seeds, waiting underground through years of drought. But when the rains finally come, and conditions align just right, these plants burst forth in what's known as a superbloom. Entire hillsides erupt in yellow, purple, and orange. For a few magical weeks, Death Valley becomes a garden. Bees buzz, butterflies flutter, and life feels suddenly abundant. But even in years without superblooms, the desert still carries green. Salt seed dispersal is another marvel. Desert plants time their flowering with the brief windows of moisture, producing seeds that can lie dormant for years, sometimes decades, until rain returns. Others produce light, wind-dispersed seeds that drift into new territory, or burr-covered seeds that hitch rides on animals. And even death is part of their plan. Some plants die quickly after flowering, using all their energy for a single chance at reproduction. Others send out shoots from their base, beginning anew while the parent plant fades. Despite their brilliance, these plants are vulnerable. Off-road vehicles crush delicate root systems. Climate change is shifting rainfall patterns, making blooms more unpredictable. Invasive grasses, introduced from afar, alter fire cycles and compete for space. But hope persists. Park rangers now work closely with botanists and tribal leaders to monitor plant populations, restore damaged areas, and educate visitors on how to tread lightly. New technologies allow scientists to study water availability in soil with greater precision, and every superbloom inspires wonder that echoes far beyond the desert. To walk through Death Valley with open eyes is to witness a quiet miracle. It's not about lush forests or vibrant jungles. It's about persistence, about waiting, about knowing when to bloom and when to rest. In the most unforgiving landscape, life still finds a way, not loudly, but profoundly. Here, in the hush of morning or the heat of day, in the whisper of wind over sand, you'll find green. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to remind us life endures.
Part 4. The Microscopic World. Hidden Ecosystems in Plain Sight. Beneath the glaring sun and towering dunes of Death Valley lies an invisible universe, one that thrives not on grand scale, but on astonishing smallness. The microscopic world here is every bit as alive and active as the desert giants, forming the backbone of its ecosystems and the foundation of survival. Let's start at ground level, literally. Biological soil crusts, known as biocrusts, are living communities made up of cyanobacteria, algae, fungi, mosses, and lichens. These organisms bind the soil together, prevent erosion, retain moisture, and even fix nitrogen, making the environment more hospitable for larger plants. To the naked eye, they look like dark, crusty patches on the ground, but under a microscope, they resemble a sprawling metropolis teeming with activity. These microbe-driven cities are fragile. A single footprint can destroy decades of growth. Within desert rocks, extremophiles, organisms that love extremes, have found sanctuary. Some bacteria live inside quartz stones, using the translucent mineral to filter harmful UV radiation while still capturing the sun's energy for photosynthesis. These crypto and insects, too, contribute to the microbial ballet. Dung beetles and scavengers recycle nutrients, spreading microbial life in their wake. Termites, though mostly hidden, aerate the soil and process decaying organic matter, leaving behind nutrient-rich castings that support plant growth. Even the atmosphere above Death Valley isn't immune to microbial influence. Dust devils and windstorms lift microbes into the air, dispersing them across vast distances. Some microbes remain viable for days in the sky, potentially seeding new environments with each gust. Scientists studying Death Valley's microbial life often describe it as a natural laboratory, one that provides insights into the origins of life, the possibilities of survival on Mars, and the resilience of biological systems in extreme conditions. The Atacama Desert, Antarctica's dry valleys, and parts of the Mojave Desert all share similarities with Death Valley's microscopic ecosystems, making it a point of global scientific interest. Yet, this delicate world is under threat. Human activity, especially off-trail hiking, vehicle travel, and climate change, can disrupt microbial communities beyond recovery. Once destroyed, biocrusts can take decades or even centuries to regenerate. Scientists and park rangers now use satellite imagery, drones, and high-resolution soil sensors to monitor these systems, advocating for education and minimal impact tourism. To understand Death Valley fully, one must not only look far into the distance or deep into the canyons, but also very, very close. Life here thrives in the tiniest corners, in the gaps between grains of sand, and in droplets smaller than the eye can see. This world is invisible to most, but it holds the secrets to resilience, to endurance, and, perhaps, even to the origins of life itself. So next time you pause in the silence of Death Valley, remember, beneath your feet and beyond your sight, an ancient and intricate life form may be watching, waiting for the rain, and ready to bloom.
Part 5. Sounds of Stillness. Listening to the desert's voice. In a place known for silence, sound becomes sacred. Not loud, not constant, but present. The acoustic landscape of Death Valley is unlike anywhere else on Earth. The absence of man-made noise opens the door to a richer, subtler experience. A soundscape shaped by wind, rock, and the occasional cry of a bird circling high above. Let us begin with the wind. It is the great composer of the desert. Sometimes it moves gently, rustling dry brush, whistling softly through canyons, or stroking the tops of sand dunes. At other times it howls with force, rushing down mountain passes and across valley floors, creating a low moan that feels almost alive. This voice of the wind isn't just atmospheric, it's emotional. It fills the void, speaks in pauses, and lingers long after it passes. In narrow canyons like Mosaic and Golden, wind sounds are amplified, turned into echoes and reverberations. These natural corridors transform whispers into waves of sound. Some hikers have compared it to walking through a vast musical instrument, where every step changes the note. Then there is the sound of rock. At first, one might assume stone is silent, but here it is full of expression. When temperatures rise and fall dramatically, rocks crack, split and shift. Geologists call this process thermal fracturing, but to a quiet observer, it may sound like soft popping, like the tick of a distant metronome. At night, these small geologic murmurs can be heard in the deep hush of the desert, speaking to the constant transformation happening all around. Life makes noise too. In springtime, when water briefly graces the land, frogs chirp from temporary pools, insects buzz, and birds return to sing. Even the wings of beetles or the rustle of a lizard darting through brush becomes noticeable. Coyotes call in the distance, their haunting howls bouncing across the valley like ancient lullabies. It is a reminder, Death Valley is never truly silent. It simply demands attention. Footsteps are part of the soundscape too. Whether crunching across gravel or padding through dunes, your presence makes music. Some visitors wear soft shoes and tread lightly, seeking not to disturb. Others find rhythm in their hiking poles, in the beat of their breath, in the sound of effort. Even human-made structures, few though they are, add to the symphony. The creak of a wooden bench at Zabriskie Point, the clang of a metal sign swaying in the wind, the low hum of a distant car crossing an empty road. And then, perhaps most strikingly, there are the moments of absolute quiet. In Death Valley, it is possible to hear your own heartbeat, to notice the sound of blinking, the faint ring of your ears adjusting to stillness. This level of quiet is rare. Some researchers visit Death Valley just to study silence. They use specialized microphones to record the natural, ambient environment, measuring sound levels lower than what human ears can detect. What they find is astounding. Even in stillness, the earth is alive with vibrations. Cultural anthropologists point out that silence has meaning too. For the Timbisha Shoshone and other indigenous groups, quiet is not absence, it is awareness. Listening is a form of respect. It is how you learn where water hides, when danger approaches, and how to find your way home. For modern visitors, this soundscape is often jarring.
Accustomed to the buzz of urban life, many are unprepared for the intimacy of quiet. But those who lean into it, who stop to listen, often discover something unexpected. A conversation between rock and wind, between past and present, between the land and the self. In this way, the soundscape of Death Valley is not just background ambiance, it is the heartbeat of the desert. So the next time you visit this stark and beautiful land, close your eyes, wait, listen. The silence will speak. Chapter 8. From Myths to Meaning. Stories etched in sand. Part 1. Ancient Footprints, Indigenous Legends and Landscapes. Long before the first wagon wheels creaked across Death Valley, long before it bore the name Death, this land was already alive, not only with heat and silence, but with stories. Whispered from one generation to the next, these stories were more than entertainment. They were maps. They were memory. They were survival. The Timbisha Shoshone people have lived in and around Death Valley for centuries, possibly thousands of years. They did not stumble into this land. They were born from it. Their name for the valley was not one of fear or finality, but of connection. They called it Tubatulabau, and the village that would later become Furnace Creek was known as Tubatanya, meaning rock paint. In the worldview of the Timbisha, the landscape was alive. Mountains were ancestors. Springs were sacred. The color of a rock or the bend of a canyon might hold the memory of a spirit or the lesson from a past event. Every feature of the desert had a role to play in the larger story of life. One story tells of the coyote and the lizard, two powerful beings who helped shape the world. According to legend, it was the lizard who gave humans fingers, while coyote had wanted them to have paws. In the end, lizard prevailed, and human beings gained dexterity, a tale told in the flick of a lizard's tail, or the ripple of a shadow moving across stone. Other stories describe how the people came to know the water sources hidden within the desert, springs like those at Warm Springs Canyon or Darwin Falls. These were not just watering holes, but places of spiritual guidance. In dreams and visions, elders would journey to these places to seek answers. Today, those sacred spaces still exist, though many are hidden, unmarked by signs, known only to a few. The Timbisha were not alone. Neighboring groups such as the Paiute, Kawayisu, and Panamint also had deep connections to this arid land. Each had stories that echoed similar themes: trickster gods, spirit guardians, and sacred journeys through the canyons. Though their languages were different, their reverence for the desert was the same. Many of these stories served practical purposes. A tale about a mountain lion's spirit haunting a certain canyon might keep children from wandering into dangerous terrain. Legends of wind spirits were reminders to travel only during the cool hours. Myths were not just culture, they were survival guides.
When European American settlers arrived in the 1800s, they misunderstood the silence of the desert and the quietude of its people. They saw emptiness. The Timbisha saw fullness. Settlers imposed new names, mapped the terrain in their own image, and often dismissed the oral traditions that had shaped the region for millennia. Despite this, the stories endured. In the 20th century, with the creation of Death Valley National Monument, many Timbisha people were displaced. Yet, even then, they maintained ties to the land. Elders passed on oral histories beneath starlit skies. Children learned where the shadows fell longest in winter, where the earth cracked with hidden springs in summer. Today, the Timbisha Shoshone tribe is officially recognized and maintains a small reservation at Furnace Creek. They continue to share their stories, not as relics, but as living truths. Modern anthropologists and park rangers now work alongside tribal leaders to document and preserve these legends, ensuring they are not lost to wind and time. For visitors willing to listen, the desert still speaks, not always in words, but in signs. The shift of a dune, the sparkle of a petroglyph in the sun, the sound of water in an unlikely place. So when you walk Death Valley's trails, remember, you tread upon ancient stories. Footprints, both literal and symbolic, are beneath your every step. They are etched into the sand, not to fade, but to remind us that even the most silent places carry voices. If only we are quiet enough to hear. Here, in one of Earth's most extreme landscapes, we find something unexpected. Not emptiness, not death, but continuity. The land endures. And so do its stories. Part 2. Sacred Trails. How Native Peoples Mapped the Land with Meaning. Long before European explorers charted the terrain or miners scratched at the earth for gold and borax, indigenous people had already mapped every corner of what we now call Death Valley. But their maps were not drawn on paper or etched in stone. They were remembered, spoken, and walked. These were not just routes from one place to another, but spiritual paths, trails that carried stories, knowledge, and ceremony. The Timbisha Shoshone, whose name means rock paint in reference to the colorful rocks of their homeland, have lived in Death Valley for over 1,000 years. Their trails were carved by footsteps and memory, passed from elder to child, not just as directions, but as tales of survival and connection. Each spring, canyon, and peak held meaning. Natural features were given names that spoke of their history or spirit, like Tupipu, meaning quiver of arrows, or Nunu-Wu, salt place. These names helped describe more than just the geography. They indicated what could be found there: water, food, danger, or sanctuary. The names themselves were part of oral maps, each one a word of warning or welcome. Seasonal migration was common. Families moved between higher elevations in summer and valley floors in winter, following game and plant harvests. These moves were not arbitrary. They were rituals of rhythm and knowledge. The timing had to be perfect. Missing the mesquite harvest, for example, could mean hunger. These ancient trails crisscrossed the valley, connecting sacred sites, water holes, and seasonal camps like beads strung along a necklace of necessity and reverence. Some of these routes later became modern roads, paved over but still echoing with the footsteps of generations. For instance, parts of the route now known as Highway 190 were once used to reach hunting grounds and trade partners far beyond the valley. The past, it seems, still shapes the present, even in asphalt. But beyond practicality, these trails were deeply spiritual. Walking them was a form of storytelling, a reenactment of the journeys taken by creator beings in indigenous lore. In many stories, powerful ancestral spirits shaped the landscape as they moved through it, splitting canyons, raising mountains, creating springs. To walk the same paths was to follow in their steps, to draw strength and guidance from those ancient acts of creation. Ceremonies often took place at specific sites.
rock shelters, high ridges, or shaded groves, where the veil between the physical and the spiritual seemed thinner. Petroglyphs etched in. Even tools and shelters were left behind with purpose. In caves near Furnace Creek, archaeologists have found cooking stones, grinding tools, and fragments of woven baskets, all arranged in ways that suggest not just utility, but ritual. These items were not abandoned. They were offerings to the land, tokens of gratitude or farewell. To the Timbisha and neighboring tribes, like the Paiute and Kawaisu, survival in this harsh land was not a battle. It was a relationship. They saw the desert not as barren, but as balanced. They read the stars and the shape of sand dunes. They knew when coyotes howled at danger and when birdsong announced the return of water. And they taught that gratitude was not optional. It was the foundation of living. Modern science now confirms what indigenous people long understood. The ecosystem of Death Valley is intricate, resilient, and interconnected. Plants communicate through roots. Animals adapt in astonishing ways. The land itself remembers, reshaping after floods, fires, and droughts. And those who walk it with respect leave something behind. Not footprints, perhaps, but energy. Today, the Timbisha Shoshone tribe still lives near Furnace Creek, maintaining cultural ties despite centuries of displacement and disruption. They run a village, a community garden, and a cultural center. They host traditional ceremonies and teach their children the old ways, passing on stories, songs, and the sacred meanings behind each mountain's shadow. For visitors, understanding this dimension of Death Valley adds a new layer to the experience. It invites a different kind of listening, not just to the wind or the silence, but to memory. It encourages travelers to tread with awareness, to recognize that every path may once have been a pilgrimage. So the next time you stand on a trail in Death Valley, pause. Look around. The stones beneath your feet may once have guided a healer. The wind may still carry the whisper of an elder's song. And the land? It remembers. Always.
Part 3. Spirits in the Stones. Petroglyphs, story rocks, and sacred sites. Across the ridges and canyons of Death Valley, there are markings, etched in stone, left behind by hands long gone. These are not graffiti or idle doodles. They are messages, memories, monuments. Known as petroglyphs, these carvings tell stories older than writing, shaped by the people who lived in harmony with this harsh and holy land. Petroglyphs are found throughout Death Valley, especially in areas like Titus Canyon, Echo Canyon, and Mesquite Flat. Some are simple, spirals, circles, handprints. Others are complex. Human figures with outstretched arms, horned animals, and abstract symbols that defy modern interpretation. But each was placed with care. Each was meant to endure. To the indigenous peoples, especially the Timbisha Shoshone, the Southern Paiute, and the Kawaisu, these petroglyphs weren't just art. They were sacred. They were maps, warnings, prayers, and stories. A spiral might mark a spring. A line of dots could trace a migratory path. A crouched figure might signal a place of vision or danger. These were visual cues passed from one generation to the next, forming a stone-bound language only the initiated could fully understand. One particularly striking example lies in the Marble Canyon region, where a series of geometric patterns lines a rock face high above the desert floor.
Some researchers believe these patterns represent star constellations or seasonal calendars, helping ancient people mark time in a landscape without clocks. Others suggest they are mnemonic devices, visual aids for oral storytelling, guiding a speaker through the chapters of a myth or a ceremonial chant. What is certain is this: the rocks remember. In nearby sites like Little Petroglyph Canyon, technically just beyond Death Valley proper, archaeologists have found entire galleries, hundreds of images carved with obsidian tools. These canyons are often considered sacred, and some are closed to the public to protect their cultural importance. Their continued preservation is not just about archaeology, it is about respect. These images are not static, they interact with light. At sunrise or sunset, shadows stretch across the carvings in ways that seem to animate them. Figures glow, shapes deepen. In some traditions, this daily dance of light was part of the story, a sign that the ancestors were still speaking, still watching, still guiding. Stone circles and cairns also appear in the desert, often aligned with celestial bodies. Some scholars suggest these were part of solstice rituals or vision quests, where seekers would fast and pray under the stars. The stones offered focus, grounding, and presence, silent companions in sacred journeys. Modern visitors might miss these details. To the untrained eye, a petroglyph may appear as nothing more than scratches. A circle of stones might seem accidental, but to those who know, or who take the time to learn, these features are chapters in a book written by wind, time, and spirit. Many stories associated with these carvings have been lost, erased by colonization, displacement, and time. Yet some remain. Indigenous elders speak of animal spirits trapped in stone, of paths walked by divine figures who shaped the world with their feet, of whispering rocks that remember the names of those who dared to listen. There's reverence in these tales, but also warning. Some petroglyphs are said to be protected by spirits. Disturb them, and misfortune may follow. Others are so sacred that they are never spoken of aloud, only acknowledged in silence or song. This is not superstition. It is a deep recognition of relationship between human and land, past and present, spirit and form. Today, tribal members continue to visit these sites, leaving offerings or simply sitting in respectful silence. The carvings may be ancient, but the connection is alive. It pulses beneath the surface, just like the water that still flows in hidden springs. Preserving these places is not only about cultural memory, it's about honoring a worldview that sees land as teacher, rock as witness, and time as circular rather than linear. In the lines and grooves of stone, we see not just the past, but a way forward, a way of walking more gently, listening more deeply, remembering more fully. So if you ever find yourself near a rock face marked by ancient hands, pause. Don't touch. Don't trace. Instead, listen. You might not understand the words, but you'll feel the presence, and that is enough. Part 4. Songs of Survival. Language, Ceremony, and Living Memory. Long before textbooks and digital archives, knowledge flowed through the valley not with ink or images, but with sound, with voice, with song. In Death Valley's indigenous cultures, oral tradition was not merely a way to communicate, it was a way to live, to survive, to remember, to belong. Each tribe, Timbisha Shoshone, Kauai Sioux, Southern Paiute, held vast libraries within their spoken words. These stories were sung in the evenings, chanted during ceremonies, whispered around fires, and sometimes carried alone in the heart of an elder as the last thread connecting generations. Language was more than a tool. It was a landscape of its own. The Timbisha language, for example, contains words that describe places so specifically they don't translate neatly into English. A term might refer to a dry wash that only runs after the first rain of spring. Another might capture the quality of moonlight on volcanic stone. In this way, vocabulary becomes geography, and vice versa. Ceremony gave structure to time. Solstices, equinoxes, migrations of animals, all were marked by gatherings that included dance, music, prayer, and food. These were not performances, but conversations with the land and sky. The people offered thanks, sought guidance, and renewed the balance between themselves and nature. Some ceremonies were held at sacred springs, where water emerged like breath from the bones of the desert. Others took place under open stars, where chants rose with the heat of night and echoed against canyon walls. Drums mimicked the heartbeat of the earth. Rattles called forth memory. Songs stretched across hours or even days, braiding generations together. Not all songs were ceremonial. Many were functional. There were songs for grinding seeds, for fetching water, for lulling children to sleep. There were songs that reminded hunters where to find deer or how to follow tracks after wind erased the trail. These melodies were woven into daily life until they became inseparable from the acts themselves. One powerful example comes from the Kauai Sioux people, who used song trails, long compositions that described how to travel from one sacred site to another. These weren't directions in the Western sense. They were immersive experiences. Walk until you see the rabbit rock, then sing of the dry bush and turn toward the sun's left arm. In this way, memory became map. As colonization spread, and yet they endured. Some elders carried entire epics in their minds, waiting for a safer time to speak. Some scribbled fragments into notebooks or onto scraps of paper. Others recorded themselves in secret, preserving voices for future generations. Today, there is a quiet renaissance. Timbisha families teach songs once whispered in fear. Linguists work with tribal leaders to document vanishing dialects. Ceremonies are being revived, not as reenactments, but as living practices. One elder likened language to a spring. Even if the surface is dry, dig deep enough, and the water is still there. This revival is not just cultural. It is spiritual. It is a reclamation of identity, of sovereignty, of connection. In a world increasingly defined by speed and noise, these songs offer slowness, stillness, meaning. To hear a traditional song in Death Valley is to hear the desert breathe, to feel the ground echo, to witness memory becoming present. Modern visitors may never fully understand the lyrics, but they can feel the resonance. Because even now, the land remembers the tune. So the next time you find yourself walking a quiet trail and the wind hums through the rocks, pause for a moment. It may not be just wind. It might be a song, a prayer, a survival. Still echoing, still alive, still sacred.
Part 5. Echoes in the Sand. Resilience, Resistance, and the Future. Indigenous life in Death Valley did not vanish with the arrival of colonizers. It adapted, it resisted, it survived in quiet defiance, in acts of care, in the stubbornness of memory. This final part of our chapter examines how Native communities faced erasure, how they endured generations of injustice, and how they are reclaiming place and voice in the land they have always called home. In the late 1800s, as mining operations and westward expansion swept across the desert, the Timbisha Shoshone were increasingly pushed from their ancestral homelands. Settlers claimed water rights, fenced grazing lands, and occupied sacred spaces. The desert was parceled and privatized, its spirit reduced to property. In 1933, when Death Valley National Monument was created, it was marketed as pristine and untouched, ignoring the native presence that had shaped the landscape for centuries. Despite these challenges, the Timbisha people stayed. They set up homes near Furnace Creek, lived in makeshift dwellings, and worked seasonal jobs for the National Park Service. But they were not simply employees or squatters. They were descendants of the land's first caretakers. Resistance took many forms. Some elders kept language alive in secret. Others tended to traditional food sources in hidden gardens. Children grew up hearing stories that were never written but always remembered. Their presence was an act of resistance. It wasn't until the late 20th century that legal recognition began to shift. In 2000, after years of advocacy, the Timbisha Shoshone Homeland Act was signed into law. It returned over 7,500 acres of ancestral land to the tribe, a small fraction of their traditional territory, but a powerful symbol of resilience. For the first time in generations, they held legal title to land they had never left. With land came possibility. The tribe established a government, created housing, developed community spaces, and launched cultural preservation programs. Youth were taught traditional practices, elders led ceremonies, and the Timbisha flag flew high over the desert wind. But challenges remain. Water rights are still contested, climate change threatens springs and plant life, and tourism continues to bring both opportunity and disruption. The desert is no longer silent. It is crowded, commercialized, and often misunderstood. In response, indigenous voices are rising louder than ever. Artists reinterpret ancient symbols. Activists fight for environmental justice. Educators lead programs inside and beyond park borders, ensuring that future generations, native and non-native alike, understand that Death Valley is not a relic. It is a living story. Technology plays a role too. Digital archives collect oral histories. Interactive maps highlight indigenous landmarks. Social media shares traditional knowledge across tribal lines and into the global sphere. What was once erased is now recorded, remembered, and retold. And perhaps most importantly, the connection to the land remains strong. Whether through basket weaving, seed gathering, or walking old footpaths, the descendants of Death Valley's original people continue to move through the desert, not as visitors, but as family. One tribal elder put it simply, "We don't own the land owns us, and it remembers." In every grain of sand there is a footprint, in every canyon echo a name, and in every sunrise over the salt flats a promise that the story is not over. It continues, in the voices of those who have always been here, and in the silence that still listens. Chapter 9. From Wilderness to Wonder. Tourism, Preservation, and the Future. Part 1. The Making of a Park. Politics, Preservation, and PR. Long before it became a national treasure, Death Valley was a mystery, a vast and inhospitable land, known more for its extremes than its beauty. To pioneers and surveyors of the 19th century, it was a place to be avoided, a hellish stretch of heat and silence. But with time, the perception shifted. What was once feared began to be admired. The desolation became alluring, and the silence started to speak. The journey to becoming a national park began with myth and mineral. In the late 1800s, borax mining operations brought the first large-scale industrial attention to the valley. The famed 20-mule team wagons hauled pale white minerals across the desert, and their imagery soon found its way into soap boxes, advertisements, and the American imagination. Borax gave Death Valley a story, one of grit, labor, and the allure of survival in the harshest conditions. By the early 20th century, interest had shifted from industry to imagery. Filmmakers began to use the stark landscape as a dramatic backdrop. Writers described its brutal beauty and awe. The desert was no longer just a minefield of hardship. It was a place of visual poetry. In 1933, President Herbert Hoover designated Death Valley as a national monument, encompassing over 2 million acres of land. It was an act of preservation, yes, but also one of branding. The National Park Service, NPS, understood that beauty sold better than danger. The desert needed a new story. With the rise of automobiles and the Great American Road Trip, Death Valley became part of the national travel narrative. Roads were carved into the wilderness, campgrounds established, and scenic vistas promoted. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs, played a crucial role during the 1930s in building infrastructure that made the park more accessible. Stone bridges, visitor cabins, and lookout towers appeared, all blending into the natural scenery. The desert was being shaped not only by wind and time, but also by intention. Still, challenges persisted. The early park system was focused more on visitation than conservation. Tourists were encouraged to experience the thrill of the desert without much regard for the fragility of the ecosystem. Off-road driving damaged cryptobiotic soils. Garbage accumulated. Springs were diverted to meet rising demand. And all the while, the indigenous peoples whose ancestors had stewarded the land for generations were either ignored or erased from the narrative entirely. The transition from monument to full national park took decades. It wasn't until 1994, with the passage of the California Desert Protection Act, that Death Valley was elevated to national park status. The act expanded its borders by 1.3 million acres, making it the largest national park in the contiguous United States. This elevation was more than a bureaucratic upgrade. It represented a shift in values. The desert was no longer simply a curiosity or a backdrop. It was recognized as an ecological marvel, a cultural tapestry, and a living, breathing system deserving of respect and protection. The Park Service adopted stronger conservation protocols, worked to restore native habitats, and began collaborating more closely with the Timbisha Shoshone people to honor their historical and spiritual ties to the land. Public messaging also evolved. The brochures and visitor centers stopped describing the valley as a wasteland or a dead zone. Instead, they spoke of wonder, resilience, and complexity. The branding pivoted from extremes to insights, from Death Valley to life amid extremes. Today, as climate change intensifies and public interest in sustainability grows, the role of the national park has expanded again. It is not just a sanctuary for endangered species or a destination for stargazers. It is a laboratory for ecological study, a classroom for climate education, a mirror held up to our changing planet. And yet, the politics remain. Balancing access with preservation, honoring indigenous sovereignty while managing federal land, accommodating millions of visitors without destroying the experience. These are daily challenges. But one thing is clear. The journey from wilderness to wonder is not over. It continues, shaped by every decision we make, every footstep, every photograph, every effort to protect what cannot be replaced. Death Valley is no longer the empty land of old maps. It is a national park, and with that title comes responsibility, not just to visit, but to understand, to respect, and to preserve. Because what we save today becomes the story tomorrow. Part 2. The Boom of Tourism, From Solitude to Spectacle. As Death Valley National Park began to mature in the public consciousness, tourism exploded. What was once a distant and obscure destination became a staple of American road trips and international travel guides. The park's raw allure, its shimmering salt flats, mysterious canyons, and unparalleled sense of scale, called to adventurers, photographers, and nature lovers alike. But this growing attention brought with it a new set of dynamics. Tourism, in its essence, is paradoxical. It seeks beauty, solitude, and authenticity, but often erodes those very qualities by sheer volume. The 21st century saw a dramatic increase in park visitation. Social media amplified the park's striking visuals, the rolling pastel waves of Zabriskie Point at sunrise, the surreal stretches of Badwater Basin under starlight, and the dusty roads leading to remote ghost towns. Instagram influencers and YouTube vloggers turned Death Valley into an aesthetic backdrop. And with every breathtaking photo came a surge in foot traffic. By the late 2010s, annual visitation began to reach over 1 million people. Many visitors were unprepared for the extremes: searing summer heat, long distances between facilities, limited cell service, and a stark absence of shade or shelter. Search and rescue operations rose. Emergency infrastructure had to evolve. Rangers reported increases in everything from dehydration to flat tires to disrespect for the delicate desert crust. Despite this, the park continued to embrace tourism's potential. New trails were mapped, signage improved, visitor centers expanded educational offerings, placing more focus on geology, indigenous history, and responsible recreation. Programs were launched to highlight the importance of leave-no-trace principles and safe travel planning. But the pressures of over-tourism couldn't be ignored. The sound of silence, the very essence of Death Valley's draw, was threatened. Traffic increased, parking lots overflowed, popular sunrise and sunset spots grew crowded. Some fragile formations were vandalized or trampled as unaware visitors wandered off designated paths. To address this, the National Park Service began to implement adaptive strategies. Timed entry systems were considered for peak seasons. More rangers were hired for education and enforcement. Trails were realigned to minimize erosion, and interpretive efforts took a more digital turn, offering online maps, virtual tours, and real-time conditions to encourage responsible exploration. The park also sought to distribute tourism more evenly. Instead of funneling everyone to the same scenic points, rangers encouraged exploration of lesser-known areas like Mosaic Canyon, Eureka Dunes, and the remote Saline Valley. By promoting hidden gems, the park hoped to relieve strain on its most vulnerable landscapes. Meanwhile, the nearby communities of Furnace Creek and Stovepipe Wells adapted too. New lodges were built with more sustainable designs. Solar arrays powered visitor facilities. Interpretive programming included not just natural history, but cultural stories from the Timbisha Shoshone. Dining and lodging offered a mix of rustic charm and modern comfort, allowing guests to feel immersed in the desert while still connected to the outside world. International tourism also left its mark. Visitors from Europe, Japan, and beyond arrived in growing numbers, often drawn by the surreal uniqueness of the place. Multilingual guides and signage were added, reflecting the global curiosity about America's most extreme national park. Yet, with each step forward, new questions emerged. How do you maintain intimacy in a place visited by millions? How do you preserve wildness when infrastructure must expand? How do you celebrate a landscape without turning it into a stage? Death Valley today exists in this delicate balance. It is both refuge and resort, both memory and moment. Tourists come and go, but the land remains, sometimes exhausted, often awe-inspiring, always waiting. And perhaps that is the paradox worth preserving. A place so seemingly lifeless that it reveals the vitality of life itself, not in what we build on it, but in how we learn to move through it, with reverence, humility, and care. Part 3. Into the Future. Preserving Wonder in a Warming World. As the world grapples with accelerating climate change, Death Valley stands at the forefront, a symbol of extremes, but also of endurance. In the years to come, this desert will face its greatest challenge yet, to survive not just in myth, but in reality. Climate projections suggest that the valley's already blistering temperatures will rise even higher. Heat waves may grow more frequent and intense, pushing beyond the tolerable limits for wildlife, vegetation, and visitors alike. Water sources, scarce even now, will be further strained, and weather patterns may shift in unpredictable ways, leading to both longer droughts and more violent flash floods. For the National Park Service, the future demands innovation. Scientists are already studying microclimates within the park to better understand how certain pockets retain life under heat stress. Experimental projects are underway to test how native plants respond to increased aridity. Technology is being deployed to monitor air quality, soil moisture, and even visitor movement to help balance human impact with ecosystem health. But science alone isn't enough. Preservation must also be emotional, cultural, and participatory. The park is expanding partnerships with the Timbisha Shoshone to integrate traditional ecological knowledge into land management strategies. These indigenous insights, based on centuries of lived experience, offer vital clues on how to live with the land, not just on it. Education, too, will be critical. Schools across the country are incorporating climate curricula using real-world case studies from Death Valley. Ranger-led programs aim to inspire the next generation of stewards, those who see the desert not as barren, but as sacred. Virtual tours and immersive media experiences are helping people connect to the park from afar, reducing unnecessary travel while deepening appreciation. On the visitor side, infrastructure is being reimagined. Solar-powered shuttles, water refill stations, and low-impact campsites are being planned or piloted. Interpretive centers are incorporating exhibits on climate adaptation, showing how even the harshest places can model resilience. Internationally, Death Valley is becoming a case study for protected areas in crisis zones. Conservationists, urban planners, and policymakers look to the park to explore how to safeguard natural beauty in the age of environmental instability. Conferences, white papers, and global initiatives increasingly highlight Death Valley as a bellwether,
What happens here may happen elsewhere, in different forms. And yet, amid all this, the essence of the valley remains unchanged. The silence still speaks. The salt flats still stretch wide and blinding. The stars still blaze in skies untouched by city light. These things must be preserved, not just with policies, but with love, because in the end, Death Valley is more than a desert. It is a lesson, a teacher, a reminder that the earth endures in ways both fierce and fragile. And if we listen, truly listen, we might just find the wisdom we need to face the future. Not by dominating nature, but by walking with it, one quiet step at a time.
Part 4. The New Storytellers: Art, Media, and the Cultural Reimagination. In the 21st century, the narrative of Death Valley is no longer just told by geologists or park rangers. It is shaped by filmmakers, photographers, digital artists, and everyday visitors who use phones, drones, and social media to reinterpret the land. These new storytellers are redefining what it means to know and feel this desert. Independent filmmakers have used the valley's surreal terrain as a stage for dystopian films, meditative documentaries, and artistic explorations of isolation. YouTube creators craft slow travel vlogs, showcasing the silence of a starlit night or the hypnotic rhythm of wind-sculpted dunes. Podcasts have begun telling the layered history of the Timbisha Shoshone, of miners and wanderers, of those who vanished and those who endured. Photographers seek not just spectacle, but subtlety, the way morning light spills across a canyon wall, or how distant rain blurs the horizon. Artists use drone footage to trace the vast emptiness from above, turning the valley into abstract art. Writers compose meditations on solitude, entropy, and resilience. Even influencers, often accused of shallow content, have sparked meaningful curiosity in millions of followers who had never heard of Death Valley before. Technology, too, has become a storytelling tool. Augmented reality, AR apps, now allow users to visualize ancient Lake Manly as they stand on the cracked flats of Badwater Basin. Virtual reality, VR experiences let students anywhere in the world explore the park's geology and history in immersive 3D. AI-generated music, trained on the soundscapes of wind and silence, evokes the mood of the place in hauntingly original compositions. Meanwhile, indigenous creators are reclaiming their voice within the park's narrative. Through murals, spoken word, and online platforms, young Timbisha artists tell the stories of their ancestors, not as a relic of the past, but as a vital and living culture. Their contributions aren't just additions, they are corrections, reminding the world that the desert's silence was never empty. It was full of voices that had been ignored. In schools and museums, Death Valley is taught not just as a geologic oddity, but as a metaphor. It becomes a lens for discussing climate anxiety, digital disconnection, the longing for stillness in a frenetic world. It becomes an invitation, not to escape life, but to feel it more deeply. Ultimately, storytelling is preservation. When people connect emotionally to a place, they fight harder to protect it. And so every photo shared, every poem written, every sound recorded becomes part of Death Valley's future. Because this place has always been shaped by those who dared to see it differently. And now, Part 5. A park worth fighting for. The future of preservation. As we look toward the future of Death Valley National Park, we find ourselves standing at a crossroads. The challenges ahead are significant, but so too are the opportunities. Preservation today is no longer a matter of simply protecting land from harm. It is about reimagining how humans relate to wild spaces, how technology supports stewardship, and how stories shape the ethics of conservation. One of the park's greatest assets moving forward is its unique role as a testing ground for large-scale environmental resilience. Because it embodies so many extremes, heat, dryness, isolation, Death Valley is increasingly seen as a natural laboratory for planetary adaptation. Climate scientists, conservationists, and ecological planners from around the world continue to use the park as a model for understanding desert ecosystems under stress. There are efforts to map ancient aquifers and protect rare springs from depletion. Technological monitoring networks are being upgraded to track temperature shifts, invasive species, and patterns in visitor behavior. Drones and satellite data aid in assessing landscape changes, while machine learning tools help anticipate threats before they escalate. In short, conservation here is evolving, from boots-on-the-ground vigilance to real-time environmental intelligence. Still, technology alone cannot save Death Valley. At its heart, preservation is about care, and care comes from connection. As such, community engagement has become a cornerstone of the park's forward-thinking initiatives. Youth programs bring students from California and Nevada into the park to learn field science and ecological responsibility. Artist residencies invite creatives to live and work on site, using their craft to interpret the desert's moods and metaphors. Crucially, partnerships with the Timbisha Shoshone continue to grow deeper and more meaningful. Cultural resource centers, guided interpretive walks, and collaborative land management projects emphasize that the park is not a blank slate for tourism. It is a living, cultural landscape. By acknowledging and centering indigenous voices, the park tells a more complete, more ethical story. Another emerging priority is accessibility. The National Park Service is investing in infrastructure to ensure that Death Valley can be appreciated by all. From ADA-compliant trails to multilingual signage and virtual experiences for those who cannot travel, the vision is clear. This park must belong to everyone. Tourism will remain a vital part of the park's identity. But going forward, it must be aligned with sustainability. Renewable energy, responsible recreation, and equitable visitation policies are already taking shape. Local communities are being consulted more directly. Lodging and transportation systems are moving toward carbon neutrality. The goal is not to reduce visitation, but to reshape it so that the land is not a backdrop to consumption, but a partner in reverence. In the coming decades, new threats will undoubtedly arise. Climate events, political shifts, funding uncertainties, each one will test the park's resilience. But Death Valley has endured far worse. It is a place shaped by pressure and time, by upheaval and endurance. Its very geology is a lesson in persistence. So what does it mean to preserve Death Valley today? It means embracing science and storytelling. It means defending sacred silences and listening to ancient voices. It means educating without preaching, building without scarring, and inviting without overwhelming. It means asking not just what we can take from nature, but what we owe to it. Because, in the end, this park is not just a wonder of geology or a record breaker of temperature. It is a mirror of our values. What we choose to protect reflects who we choose to be. And if we protect Death Valley, if we protect it fully, wisely, and lovingly, we protect something far more enduring than a desert.
we protect the possibility of balance, the hope of harmony, the future of wonder itself. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Sand, Reflections, Legends, and the Soul of Death Valley. Part 1. Whispers of the Past, Folklore, Ghost Towns, and Vanished Trails. The silence of Death Valley is not empty. It is layered with memory, with whispers, with the footfalls of those who walked the sands long before maps, before signs, before asphalt roads cut their way into the wilderness. Every place here has a story, and some of the most haunting are the ones that survive not in textbooks, but in a breathless pauses between wind gusts and the rustle of tumbleweeds. These are the folk tales, the ghost stories, and the legends passed down from wanderer to wanderer, from miner to ranger, from one quiet observer to another. Let us begin with the ghost towns, silent witnesses to ambition and abandonment. In the early 20th century, the promise of riches beneath the desert floor drew prospectors in droves. Towns sprang up almost overnight. Rhyolite, Ballarat, Panamint City, each was a testament to human hope and to the desert's indifference. Rhyolite once boasted electric lights, a train station, and an opera house. Today, its crumbling ruins stand beneath a sky too big for roofs. Windows are hollow, doorways frame only emptiness. A few walls cling to the idea of shelter, but mostly, Rhyolite is a memory, sun-bleached and wind-scoured, an echo of a boom that turned to bust in less than a decade. Ballarat is quieter still. Here, rusting trucks and half-toppled stone cabins tell of miners who came with dreams and left with sunburns. It is said that the spirits of those who stayed behind still roam these ruins, especially when the moonlight slants just right and the coyotes hold their breath. Then, there are the trails that have vanished into sand, footpaths of the Timbisha Shoshone, wagon ruts from the ill-fated parties of westward settlers, forgotten stagecoach routes that once linked desolate outposts. Few remain visible. Most are erased each year by wind and time, but those who know where to look can sometimes find their shadows, faint as a footprint in dust. Folklore fills in what history forgets. Tales of lost gold mines, cursed canyons, and buried treasure. The most famous, perhaps, is the legend of the lost Breyfogle mine, a hidden vein of rich ore stumbled upon by a wandering prospector named Breyfogle, who vanished before he could lead anyone else to it. For generations, fortune hunters have searched the hills, hoping to succeed where Breyfogle disappeared. Then there are the supernatural stories, lights that dance without source, voices that call across empty plains, apparitions of weary travelers who never made it out. Death Valley, some say, is not just a desert, but a thin place, where the veil between the past and present is easily stirred. Even the names whisper legend. Hell's Gate, Devil's Golf Course, Furnace Creek, Dante's View. Each name a suggestion of something otherworldly, or at least something beyond the normal scale of life. What draws people to these stories? Perhaps it is the human need to place meaning in vastness, to weave narrative into silence, to believe that even the most desolate places remember. Or perhaps it is because, in places like Death Valley, where the land outlives memory, stories become the only compass we have. So when you walk the trails or stand in the ruins of a forgotten settlement, know that you are not alone. The desert is quiet, yes, but it is not empty. It is full of voices, of laughter and warning, of footsteps and farewells, echoes in the sand, waiting for a listener. Part 2. Echoes in Empty Streets. The rise and fall of Death Valley's boomtowns. Before Death Valley was a national park or a quiet sanctuary for introspection, it was something far more raucous, a stage for ambition, greed, and desperation. The landscape we now revere for its silence was once alive with the clamor of picks, mules, steam engines, and saloon doors. The desert held promises of fortune, and people came in droves to claim them. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the American West was caught in a fever, an insatiable desire for mineral wealth. Gold, silver, and especially borax were the minerals of the moment. Tales of riches hidden in the mountains lured prospectors from across the country. With picks on their shoulders and hope in their hearts, they marched into Death Valley, prepared to face the heat, the isolation, and the uncertainty. What they built, against all odds, were boom towns. Towns like Rhyolite, Skidoo, and Ballarat appeared almost overnight. Rhyolite, perhaps the most famous, was founded in 1905 after a promising gold discovery nearby. Within just a couple of years, the town boasted electric lights, a stock exchange, a train station, hotels, schools, even an opera house. It was a full-fledged city rising from dust. But like most boom towns of the West, Rhyolite burned bright and fast. By 1916, less than a decade later, the mines were exhausted, the money gone, and the people had vanished. Buildings stood empty, windows shattered by the wind, and silence reclaimed the streets. Today, Rhyolite is one of the most haunting ghost towns in America, its decaying ruins a monument to fleeting dreams. Skidoo was different. Located high in the Panamint Mountains, it depended on a 23-mile pipeline to deliver water for its milling operations. Ingeniously designed and constructed, the pipeline was a marvel of desert engineering. At its peak, Skidoo supported nearly 700 residents. But its claim to fame wasn't just mining. It was also home to the only legal execution in Death Valley history. In 1908, a man was hanged for murder, a grim reminder that law and order in the frontier came with its own brand of justice. Ballarat, founded in 1897, served as a supply hub for surrounding camps. It had a post office, general store, and a few saloons. Notably, it was one of the last towns to fade. It even found brief fame in the 1960s when Charles Manson's followers took refuge in the nearby mountains. Today, Ballarat is mostly inhabited by a single caretaker who sells drinks and stories to curious travelers. These towns are more than decaying buildings. They are time capsules. Each weathered board and rusted tool whispers of lives once lived in haste, of fortunes won and lost, and of a land that both gave and took with equal cruelty. Ghost towns across Death Valley have one thing in common: impermanence. Nothing lasted. Dreams dissolved. People moved on. And nature, patient and relentless, reclaimed what was hers. And yet, they remain, in part because people continue to remember them. Tourists visit the remains. Historians document the ruins. Artists sketch the broken windows and collapsing roofs. In doing so, these towns take on a new life, not as places of commerce, but as places of memory.
They challenge us to consider what we leave behind when we go in search of more. What do we build? What do we break? What becomes of the communities that form on the edges of survival? Today, as you walk through Rhyolite's crumbling bank vault or peer into Ballarat's dusty jail, you can still feel it. The echo of footsteps, the murmur of conversation, the silent weight of longing. These echoes belong to a different time, but they have not disappeared. They've only settled into the quiet. And perhaps that is what makes ghost towns so compelling. They are reminders that even in a place as unforgiving as Death Valley, people once dared to dream out loud. And those dreams, even in decay, continue to whisper. Part 3. Trails that vanished, lost roads, secret passages, and hidden histories. Before Death Valley was mapped and managed, before GPS and guidebooks, there were trails, paths known only to those who walked them. Some were made by native peoples, others by pioneers, traders, or outlaws. And over time, many of them disappeared, swallowed by shifting sands, lost in the folds of forgotten maps. Some of these trails were lifelines. The Timbisha Shoshone used footpaths that wove between springs, shadowed canyons, and sacred sites. These routes weren't just practical, they were spiritual. Moving through the desert meant reading the land, the tilt of the sun, the whisper of the wind, the tracks left by animals. The desert was a map, but only for those who knew how to read it. With the arrival of settlers and explorers in the 19th century, new routes emerged, often more direct, but far more dangerous. The ill-fated 1849 party of 49ers, trapped and dying in the valley, carved their own trail west, giving the valley its name. Their path, desperate, improvised, barely passable, became legend. Today, it's known as the route of the Death Valley 49ers, a cautionary tale of ambition, miscalculation, and survival. Other trails were tied to industry. Borax wagons once thundered along what became known as the 20-mule team route, connecting remote mines with rail lines far beyond the desert. These routes required incredible logistical planning, and the men and animals who navigated them became icons of resilience. Today, the faded ruts can still be traced in places, etched into the earth like the bones of some ancient beast. But not all trails were sanctioned. Smugglers and outlaws also used Death Valley's remoteness to their advantage. Hidden passes through the Funeral Mountains or the Black Range offered concealment and escape. Stories still circulate about gold caches buried near old mines, or about a phantom wagon loaded with silver that vanished into a storm, never to be seen again. Over time, many of these paths faded. The desert is not kind to memory. Winds erase footprints. Flash floods rework the land. Vegetation shifts. Maps are redrawn. What was once a main road becomes a mystery. And yet, some refuse to disappear completely. Hikers and historians stumble upon old trail markers, abandoned tools, or hand-carved symbols etched into stone. GPS reveals faint outlines from above, ghosts of roads on the landscape. And oral histories passed down through generations keep the memory of these trails alive. The vanishing of trails isn't just a logistical loss. It's a metaphor. It speaks to how quickly human endeavor can dissolve when it's no longer needed.
It reminds us that the desert doesn't archive, it resets. What isn't remembered is reclaimed. Still, efforts are being made to rediscover and protect some of these routes. Archaeologists, working with indigenous communities, retrace ancient paths. Preservationists campaign for the recognition of historical corridors. And the National Park Service maps what it can, offering modern explorers a chance to follow. If not in exact steps, then at least in spirit. So, as you walk the sandy trails of Death Valley today, pause now and then. Look for the subtle signs, a pile of stones that doesn't belong, a smooth groove worn into the rock, a feeling that others have passed this way before. Because they have, and though their footprints may be gone, the path remains, if only you know how to see it. Part 4. Desert Time. Reflections on memory, impermanence, and the stories we leave behind in Death Valley. Time doesn't move in straight lines. It curves, it crumbles, it collects in forgotten corners like wind-blown sand. And while the rest of the world races toward tomorrow, here, among ghost towns, vanished trails, and whispering rocks, the past holds its ground. This place is a museum with no walls. Every broken bottle, rusted can, and weathered sign is an artifact. Each canyon tells a story, even if the words have been eroded by time. The desert doesn't rush to explain. It waits, and in that stillness, something profound begins to settle in. We often think of deserts as empty, voids in the landscape. But Death Valley is full of memory, full of meaning. It's just hidden, wrapped in silence, disguised as stillness. Like a book written in a forgotten language, it only speaks to those willing to stop and listen. The old miner who etched his name into a canyon wall didn't know he was leaving behind a message for the future. He was just marking a moment. But now, a century later, that scratch in the rock becomes a connection, a fragile thread linking us to a life once lived. It's easy to erase, but harder to forget. Time in the desert feels different. Days are long yet fleeting. Sunrises stretch slowly across the horizon, while sunsets vanish in a blink of an eye. One storm can transform a landscape for decades. One choice, one wrong turn, can echo for generations. And as much as we try to conquer the desert, with roads, with maps, with names, it resists, it reclaims. What we abandon, it buries. What we forget, it erases. Yet it also preserves. Under layers of dust, entire chapters of human history lie waiting. Old journals, rusted tools, forgotten campsites. These are not just relics. They are stories paused mid-sentence. All they need is a reader. Visitors to Death Valley often speak of feeling small, but it's not a diminishing feeling. It's a humbling one. To stand in a place that has seen so much and remembers so little is to be reminded of our own impermanence. And in that reminder, there is comfort. We are not meant to last forever, but perhaps, if we're lucky, a part of us will linger, etched into stone, whispered in legend, or remembered in the quiet awe of someone who followed. Part 5. The Final Silence, What Remains, and Why It Matters. As the sun dips behind the ridges and the sky fades to a soft, dusty blue, we come to the edge of our journey, not just through Death Valley's geography and history, but through the echoes it leaves behind. In this final silence, we ask a question that haunts every visitor. What remains? What endures in a place that erases so much? The answer is as elusive as the valley's shadows. It lies not just in facts and artifacts, but in feelings. Death Valley is not simply a place. It is an experience, a confrontation with scale, silence, and solitude. It strips away distractions and offers a rare kind of clarity. It is a place where nothing seems to happen, and yet everything does. You see it in the light, how it clings to the salt flats and dances on canyon walls. In the wind, how it whispers through abandoned mine shafts and ancient riverbeds. In the stars, so close and sharp they feel like they might pierce the sky. Each of these elements carries a memory, even if it cannot speak. What remains is also what we choose to see. Some will remember the ghost towns, silent and skeletal, monuments to ambition and impermanence. Others will carry the legends of lost gold, of ancient curses, of wanderers who vanished into the dunes. And still others will remember the quiet, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat, and maybe even your own history. There's a paradox here. The desert is a place of death, yet it teaches us how to live. It tells us that value is not always visible, that presence does not require permanence, that meaning doesn't always come in words or even actions, but in the space between them. Some places are famous for what they offer. Death Valley is remembered for what it takes away: comfort, certainty, time. But in doing so, it gives something more profound. It gives you a version of yourself, smaller, quieter, maybe wiser. Those who return to Death Valley often describe a pull, as if something there remains unfinished or unspoken. Maybe it's the stories, maybe it's the silence. Maybe it's the understanding that in the vastness of this place, we are all temporary, but never insignificant. Because what truly remains in Death Valley isn't a trail or a town. It's the impression you leave behind, the way you pause before a canyon, the way you exhale under the stars, the way you carry its silence with you long after you've gone. In the end, this desert doesn't remember names. It remembers moments. And if you've listened, truly listened, then you've left something behind too. Not just footprints in sand, but presence in stillness, and perhaps, just perhaps, a whisper that lingers in the wind.